we're pretty steady within the bands that we guide to and predict, and we look to ensure that our supply chains for key commodities that we need to run our business are in place. And we're not seeing any supply issues. We're certainly seeing some price volatility, but not seeing supply issues at this point in time.
What about the personnel issue, the human issue, as you get more disruptions economically, and certain nations where you are mining are going to be more affected, certainly, if not directly by the conflict, by the ramifications of higher energy prices, of higher food prices? How do you counteract that?
We certainly, so we operate through the Americas, we're in West Africa and Australia. We certainly will be looking at what we pay our people. About 50% of our cost is wages. So the workforce that we have, we certainly keep a close eye to ensure we remain competitive so that we have a stable workforce. And then we need to keep a close eye in terms of some of those inflationary impacts to ensure that we're retaining people, but that they can make ends meet. And again, that's something that we constantly monitor. And again, we'll monitor that as we see what inflationary impacts may come as a result of this current conflict.
Tom Palmer, thank you, sir. And next time we catch up, hopefully we'll talk about your company, what you're doing, a whole lot more. Tom Palmer there of Newbond. Just hearing from Nestle, Lisa, from a spokesperson, on closures in Ukraine. They're saying they're temporary for safety reasons, but ultimately shutting factories, warehouses, and the supply chain in Ukraine. Inevitable. This is the business fallout, but that's the first major company that I can think of this morning that's come out and made a statement like that.
I have to be honest, it's heartbreaking to see how quickly this is moving, especially knowing that the supply chains are being shut because people are holed up in basements trying to hide from some of the shellings. The issue for a lot of people, and I go back to Gina Martin-Adams, is how central some of the supplies are, not only of Ukraine and Russia, but just more broadly in the supply chain complex, specifically for tech she was talking about, the metals, the mining, and the gas. Honestly, we're going to see increasing statements like this out of a number of businesses.
I want to turn down to Washington, D.C. again and catch up with Anne-Marie, and hopefully we can do the same with Maria Tadeo out of Brussels. Anne-Marie in Washington, at about 12:30, we hear from the President of the United States. We've talked all through this morning about what's been happening with the commodity market. Cruise rallied in a big way. We need to understand how this administration will offset it. We've talked about the three options on the table: a gas tax holiday, an Iranian deal, a reserve release too. You've done some reporting on this over the last couple of months, some reporting on who the US administration has been speaking to ahead of this. They've planned for these kind of moments. It's materialized. What's on the table?
Well, listen, there's been discussions about another SPR release for weeks now, and this has publicly come out from a number of officials. What they would do, though, likely, is to do it in tandem. That's where they think they can have the most impact. So this would be calling up other consumers. One of the biggest issues right now, though, of course, is being one of the biggest consumers that you would want on board for an SPR release would be China. And China, at the moment, is not taking a stance in the United Nations that was very clear last night that would match up what the U.S. would want to hear.
Anne-Marie Horton with us, 50 minutes away from an important speech by President Biden as well. David Weston and Joe Matthew will give you coverage of that speech into the 12 noon hour. The Dow Jones Industrial Average a negative 641. With our first word news in New York, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. Vladimir Putin says that the U.S. and its allies have crossed a red line, so he has begun a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia launched a barrage of missile, artillery and air attacks early today. Ukraine has reported that dozens of its soldiers have been killed, and it says the capital, Kiev, was under attack. President Biden is threatening to impose more sanctions and will speak after a virtual meeting with other G7 leaders. NATO is continuing to deploy more land and air forces to member countries near Ukraine. The alliance will hold a virtual summit Friday to discuss its reaction to the invasion. The Biden administration has repeatedly ruled out sending U.S. or NATO forces into Ukraine. And the Russian invasion is jeopardizing the chances of reaching an agreement with Iran on its nuclear program. World powers at the negotiating table found themselves on opposite sides of Europe's biggest security crisis since World War II. Envoys have suggested a successful conclusion to the talks could be just days away, but the U.S. and Iran still have to resolve some key differences. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Ritika Gupta, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate that this morning. We welcome all of you to our special coverage here. Lisa, very quickly, a tweet from certainly one of the experts on European oil and gas.
Javier Blas coming out early this morning and saying that he hopes to be proven wrong, but he expects an actual expediting of purchases by Europe of Russian gas. And he basically is saying it is confirmed that European utilities are set to buy tomorrow more Russian natural gas from Gazprom via Ukraine pipelines. Yes, you read that right. Europe will be buying more natural gas from Russia via Ukraine tomorrow. It is how capitalism works, and it highlights the interconnectedness and dependency even amid this humanitarian and military crisis.
Over the last number of days, it has been a balance of power led without question by the intelligence quality of the Biden administration. Everyone we've talked to has made clear that we've been out front in messaging this invasion. And yet the shock of invasion, David Weston here, he will lead our coverage into the Biden comments here within the hour. David, your thoughts on this historic morning?
Well, first of all, pick up on what you just said. It turns out that the Biden administration was right. They said this was going to happen. They kept saying it no matter what anybody else said. And it turns out, sadly, particularly for the people in Ukraine, they were right. We are looking forward to President Biden appearing, we hope, around 12:30 today. Terribly important speech. Obviously, he'll be talking to the American people. He will be talking to President Putin. But at this point, we're past the point of deterrence. We're into pain and punishment. So I'm really going to be focused on what he is saying to two other groups. They are, one, our allies, because we need to keep them with us as we go forward with sanctions.
Right.
And the other one is the rest of the world. We talk a lot about moral hazard in financial markets. There's a moral hazard if there aren't real consequences for Vladimir Putin, for people like, for example, to pick one, President Xi.
David, and I'll pick on Lindsey Graham, but the response from Capitol Hill, we've been remiss in not following this through the hours this morning. It's been very global. With balance of power, you go local as well, and local's Washington, and that means politics. What's the political mix in Washington as the president speaks?
Well, it's a terribly important point because, as you know, Tom, you and I are of an age that we remember when politics stopped at the water's edge.
Watch what you say.
No, not longer. Well, maybe I'm older than you are. That's true. But the politics don't stop at the water's edge any longer in the United States. At the same time, by and large, I would say Republicans have been supportive of President Biden. Some of them say he should have moved earlier, should have did more, but they support him. And then, of course, you have somebody who is not in Washington, but down at Mar-a-Lago, who came out and said he thought what Vladimir Putin was doing was genius, was the word he used.
David, really the focus at this point might be gas prices for President Biden. How much pain is he willing to sustain? And then going forward, what can he do to perhaps increase the energy independence of the United States? How much of a pivot would he have to do to make this kind of move? How much pushback from his own internal advisors, given the fact that he's been trying to move away from fossil fuels?
Well, it's a great question about exactly what is left of, or how there are modifications made to his climate approach. He's going to have to take a fresh look at that. Obviously, we have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that he is no doubt considering releasing some of. That's a short-term solution, as you know, Lisa. The real question in my mind is, what about Iran? Because they've been talking about in the background, maybe we're close to a deal with Iran. Could that give him a bridge, SPR, into Iran to alleviate some of that pain?
We've been also talking about the SWIFT financial system this morning, the idea that UK Boris Johnson came out and actually supported removing Russia from that financial system. Olaf Scholz of Germany saying that they wouldn't support that. And it's understandable, it's expected by a lot of people based on the dependency on Russian gas. Which is the closer alliance for President Biden right now, given where we are in this conflict?
You know, I think this is herding cats, frankly. He's got to keep the alliance together, whatever that takes. And as you point out, we seem to be having a slight difference of opinion on when it comes to SWIFT. There's also the issue, Lisa, that you know so well. That is, some people call it the nuclear option to really interfere with SWIFT. What ramifications could that have for the United States and the United States economy, and particularly the role of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency? It could have ramifications that would spill back against the United States.
David Weston, stay with us here as we continue our coverage. We do have markets on the move on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. The Dow negative 700, SPX negative 55. These are significant moves. A 3,900 handle on S&P 500 would be extraordinary. We're not there yet, but 4171 harkens to what we heard from Mike Wilson of Morgan Stanley earlier this morning. The 2-year in 9 basis points. Fear, Price up, yield down with a 151. We see that on the 2-year. Oil 103, not doing much. And I really want to note Russian ruble has weakened in the last 2 hours, I'd say, out to 87 rubles per dollar, and that is of importance. Anne-Marie Horton is in Washington awaiting the president's speech. Anne-Marie, you are on the phone. When you're not with us, full disclosure, folks, she's glued to the phone reporting. What have you learned?
Well, listen, what we just spoke about a moment ago was that President Putin was gathering with a number of businesses, and I was trying to find out who was there. Igor Sechin was there, Leroy Snefsky, you know, this is his right-hand man, he's known as Darth Vader. But Natalia, one of our producers, was watching this, and she told me the sentiment was definitely much more of trying to convince them. This is something I had to do in regards to Ukraine. That says to me that President Putin might be, for the first time in a while, slightly worried about a little bit of blowback amongst the political elites he keeps around him. Because if you've ever seen him interact with them, it is very much in a little bit of a demeaning way. But, of course, I'm here at the White House, so my focus will be shifting very soon to that in about half hour, 45 minutes, when the president will take the podium. And this is going to be a very important speech of his presidency, but also historically for the United States on what they're going to say in their condemnation against Russia and the swift penalties they are going to impact on the Kremlin.
Anne-Marie, based on your conversations with folks at the Beltway, do they feel like they are dealing with a rational player in Vladimir Putin?
So we've talked about this all week. I don't like to get inside the head of President Putin. I've studied him for a bit. I think we need to look at his actions. This is someone who has, yes, this is probably the most severe he has gone in terms of crossing international norms and lines. But, you know, we should note, again, I don't know how many times I should say it. This is the 4th time. This is the breakup of the Soviet Union. He has unilaterally changed the game. He changed the map. I think for many, they thought this incursion was going to be Eastern Ukraine. This is something he has talked about a lot. Eastern Ukraine was always supposed to be part of Russia. I think the fact that you are seeing images and you're hearing intel about troops from the north coming down from Belarus 2.5 hours on either side of that river to Kiev is incredibly worrisome.
Anne-Marie Horton, thank you so much, and she will continue an arduous day here with the president speaking in about 35 minutes is the scheduled time. Right now, we would like to finish a long morning with Julian Lee, who is expert on oil and the dynamics of oil across the political landscape of Europe. He's really quite qualified to help us here at 11:51 Wall Street time, the Dow negative 670 right now. Julian Lee, you, more than anyone I know in the Bloomberg world, understands how fragile the mix is of supply and demand in oil. How did that fragility, that narrowness, that marginal barrel, how did that change today?
I think the margin has potentially got a lot narrower. There isn't strong talk at the moment of sanctions on Russian oil, but we are starting to see traders being very wary of lifting Russian crude, perhaps fearful that they might get caught up in sanctions either that target the banking infrastructure or shipping or some other sort of tangential elements to the oil trade. There's also, I think, the big concern that, you know, having sent troops in, not just to eastern Ukraine, but heading towards the capital, that really, I think people are starting to question where will Putin stop in terms of what he is prepared to do and how he is prepared to retaliate, and would he, in some sense, try to use oil and gas exports as a weapon by holding them off the market for perhaps a period of time. I mean, I think that would be a very costly decision for him to make, but I think it's something that people are no longer entirely willing to rule out.
Julian, do you get the sense that oil prices are not higher because people do not think that Europe will go through with the harshest measures, actually leading Russia to cut off oil and gas supplies?
I think that's certainly possible. I mean, I do feel at the moment that markets, having reacted first thing this morning, are now in a little bit of a wait-and-see mode. What is President Biden going to say? How are Western powers going to react to this? What is the scope of sanctions likely to be in the short term? And then we're also looking at the possibility of releases of crude from strategic stockpiles around the world if prices continue to go up. We've got an OPEC Plus meeting next week, which has suddenly got a lot more interesting than it seemed to be a week ago, not least because Russia is a member of the OPEC Plus group, and I think that puts them in a very difficult position as they look at what they're going to do with their own production policy.
Julian, we have to leave it there. Thank you, sir. Julian Lee from Bloomberg on the commodity market. Tom, as you know, in times like these, sometimes, the market can shape the tone of the conversation. And on a day like today, it really shouldn't, as we turn positive on the NASDAQ and we're down about 1% on the S&P, because nothing's changed in Ukraine. If anything, Tom, it's getting worse, not better.
Across these hours, and John, what our team has done really, folks, from 11 p.m. last night is we heard earlier, John, how Biden nailed this with the intelligence and everybody woke up shocked. I was shocked, John, when I saw that Odessa had been attacked from the Black Sea. But the single point for me, John, in this morning's tone was General Hodges, a decorated and wounded infantryman of the U.S. Army. He said the U.S. Army must show troops, NATO must show troops, because Putin will not confront the U.S. military.
The U.S. intelligence has called this, Lisa, play by play, turn by turn, piece by piece. And it's no longer according to sources. It's public. It's President Putin's own words. He's looking to demilitarize the country and change the leadership.
And they cannot do a tranched response with respect to the sanctions. They've got to lay the cards on the table. They're going to try to do that in a unified manner, as Vladimir Putin moved a lot faster than they were expecting. And a lot of people are trying to figure out how they can all get on the same page when oil and gas affects different regions in very different ways from Russia.
And we're putting these sanctions together, Lisa, in real time. Seemingly, it's happening in real time right now.
With Boris Johnson coming out saying perhaps they should target and take Russia out of the SWIFT financial payment system, Olaf Scholz saying no, not the kind of disunity that they want to see at this point when they want to create a united front against Russia.
A dark day for Europe, for Ukraine, and for the people of Ukraine as well. For the leadership in Europe, the response has been clear. They're accusing Russia of bringing war back to the continent, things we haven't seen for a long time. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Russia would like to demilitarize the country and change the leadership. The people of Ukraine are in for a really tough time ahead. Foreign leadership now has to react. We'll get that reaction from the President of the United States at 12:30 Eastern Time. Full coverage will continue on Bloomberg TV and on Bloomberg Radio. From the Bloomberg Surveillance team, thank you for choosing Bloomberg.
Italian government has introduced new curbs that seek to stem activities for the unvaccinated. Italy currently has one of the highest vaccination rates in Europe. About 90% of the population above 12 has received 2 doses of COVID-19 vaccine. But as the number of cases has been rising in recent weeks, Prime Minister Mario Draghi has been seeking to convince even the last people to get a COVID shot.
E non dobbiamo mai perdere di vista una constatazione, che gran parte dei problemi che abbiamo oggi dipende dal fatto che ci sono dei non vaccinati. Persone non vaccinate hanno una probabilità molto maggiore di sviluppare la malattia e forme gravi della malattia.
A proof of vaccination or a proof that the person recovered from COVID is called Super Green Pass. A Super Green Pass is required also to drink an espresso at the bar. I'm going for coffee in Central Rome. This bar in Central Rome has introduced an automatic reader for the pass. People need to show the proof before accessing the bar. The government has also approved a mandatory vaccination for people aged above 50 years.
Inflation is a real question, and it's coming throughout the business. It's coming in supplies, it's coming in wage inflation, etc. So, of course, the key here is to maintain a pricing.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to a special edition of Balance of Power covering the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I'm joined for these 2 hours by my colleague and friend Joe Matthew in Washington. So welcome, Joe. Great to have you right here with us. It's a different day today than it was yesterday, isn't it?
Well, that's for sure, David, and just incredible speed as we watch this story develop. But there's so much we don't know in the fog of war here in the early hours of what's happening in Ukraine. But, David, some truths are emerging as we step back from what's happening right now in Ukraine. U.S. intelligence was correct about what Vladimir Putin's intentions were. The White House has been telling us for weeks that this was going to happen. And by extension, I would also suggest that Vladimir Putin, we now know, has been bluffing. The Russians have been telling us for weeks as well that they never had any intention to invade Ukraine. And of course, we're watching this happen now in real time. The question is, David, how far will Vladimir Putin go?
Yeah, and the question also is, what did we get out of intelligence? And some people are suggesting now, even though we didn't keep Vladimir Putin from going into Ukraine, maybe we bought some time to work things out with our allies.
That's right, and I suspect that we're going to be hearing about our allies from President Biden, who's going to speak a little bit later on. He's scheduled to talk from the White House in about a half hour's time here, David. Of course, he might be a bit late, but we want to go to the White House right now with Bloomberg Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Hordern, who joins us from the North Lawn. Anne-Marie, we're going to have quite a number of developments over the course of this day. The next one is going to be the president's speech here. What do we expect him to say?
He's going to come out swift with that language against Vladimir Putin, an absolute condemnation of what we are seeing across the world with Russia invading Ukraine. He's also, of course, going to give his deepest sympathies and support and prayers to Ukrainian people. You know, one thing, especially on a day like today when you're seeing financial markets under pressure, oil through the roof, $100 a barrel, we shouldn't lose sight of the humanity of this situation right now in Ukraine, and also the refugee crisis that we already are seeing taking place today. Individuals fleeing Ukraine for other parts of Europe. I'm already seeing that in Hungarian television. So the president's going to first, of course, do the politics of all of this. This is an important speech, not for his presidency, but also historic for the United States and where they see their place in the world. And then, of course, there's going to be the penalties. And for that, we are still waiting. There's a range of options the U.S. can do, and they've been consulting with their allies throughout the morning. And in a half-hour time, we'll get an update on what they plan to do in terms of penalizing President Putin and the Kremlin and what that means for the Russian economy.
Anne-Marie, there'll be a lot of different audiences really tuning in to listen to what President Biden has to say. Which is the most important one to President Biden, to the White House right now?
It's very hard to answer that question because I would always want to say that the American people are, of course, the president's #1 audience, always. But on a day like today, I imagine this speech is going to be shown across Moscow and is going to be played in the Kremlin, where President Putin just met with dozens of Russian elite businessmen and women, making sure he could shore up their support. And I imagine it is that room that is keenly interested in what the U.S. president has to say.
Anne-Marie, the president began his day in the Situation Room, an important meeting with the National Security Council, then a meeting of the G7 nations. I know that went on for over an hour. Are we to believe that they're still building the plane in flight here, if you will, that President Biden is still in talks about exactly what he's about to announce in terms of sanctions, or is this about getting everyone on the same page?
Listen, of course they're going to have a consultation right after they finally realize what came to fruition, which is what they've been telling us for weeks, what the Kremlin's action, President Putin's actual plans were when it came to Ukraine, way beyond and further west past Donbass and eastern Ukraine. I imagine that they have a number of options they can take, but we have heard reporting this morning from the Financial Times, for example, saying that Boris Johnson wants to go heavy on SWIFT, but he will only do so if the remainder of the international community is on board. Already we saw some pushback in this report from Germany. The White House agrees. If the U.S. is going to take Russia off of SWIFT, everyone has to agree. So I imagine it's some of these major big issues that are going to inflict a lot of pain on their own economies that are going to be the ones that potentially there was still a bit of debate about. But you can imagine they've had the sanctions ready.
Anne-Marie, they've said they've had the sanctions ready. We hope that that's certainly true. We heard from President Biden earlier this week on a limited set of sanctions. There was some criticism. The White House said we have to keep some of our back pocket in case things get worse. Well, things I think it's fair to say have gotten worse. Is what we hear today going to be it? Is that the full enchilada, so to speak?
Well, we just don't know yet, but I did hear from one official that there is a little bit of like different thinking when it comes to how do you approach this situation. Do you bring everything to the table today? Everything at all, even including an SPR release, which is the administration has been talking about, things like that, an SPR release or calling up other nations to try to help with LNG to Europe. Do you put everything on the table today, or do you also drag it out and hit Russia today, hit Russia Friday, hit Russia Monday morning, hit Russia Tuesday, and then make it a little bit chaotic for the Russians and those elites that surround President Putin?
How about with more on energy for Europe, Anne-Marie? I know this is part of your area of expertise. We saw the Emir of Qatar in the Oval Office just a couple of weeks ago. This administration has been talking about finding, or at least helping Europe find alternate sources of energy to take some of the sting out of what might be about to happen. Do we have any sense of where that lies?
Well, already from that report, which we initially had that out first, we already saw one tanker that was supposed to be going to Japan go to Europe. So already some of the moves the administration has been talking about over the course of the week, we're actually seeing take place in the market. Now, the issue with all these countries coming together and trying to help Europe sending LNG is incredibly difficult. Europe is just not set up for a mass inload of LNG in terms of storage. Also, it's much more expensive. Russian oil and gas is very cheap, and that is exactly why Europe at this moment is pretty much enslaved to it.
Anne-Marie, to what extent should we be watching President Biden's remarks with a view toward China? There's a lot of concern about what the relationship between China and Russia is. Of course, we saw that joint appearance at the beginning of the games. Not clear exactly what China's position is today. They could make a difference, could they not, in how badly whatever sanctions are imposed really hit Russia.
Yeah, they could put a little bit more of a tilt on how they feel. And this is certainly an issue that President Putin is going to care about, right? I mean, he's the junior partner in this relationship with Xi Jinping. That's abundantly clear. But he needs that relationship more than ever. The issue with China right now is they have not come out against Russia. That was made very clear last evening at the UN Security Council meeting. They have walked this very fine line. And Xi Jinping is going to be another audience that will want to hear what President Biden has to say. What are the implications of an invasion? what are the implications of that? Because this is someone who we have talked for weeks. What are they going to do in terms of Taiwan? If Xi Jinping was ever going to make a play on Taiwan, this is going to be the playbook he's going to look about what the penalties will be for his government. Also, the timing for Xi Jinping, we should just quickly note, is terrible. The Chinese Communist Party does not want to be dealing with this at the moment. They wanted a clean Olympics, and then they wanted to focus on this massive party gathering they have that comes twice a decade and is going to cement Xi Jinping's legacy. And for them, this is a lot of noise and chaos.
Anne-Marie, we spent a lot of time talking about strategy, about tanks and planes, about the outcome of a new war in Europe, but that's going to come as well with a humanitarian crisis. How prepared is this administration to work with our allies in Poland, for instance, to deal with what could be tens of thousands of people coming across the border?
It's a great question. Europe is still dealing with a refugee crisis from Syria. They are still dealing with, I intimately am aware of, a refugee crisis after the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan in August. This is a Europe that has been dealing with a refugee crisis for years. So Europe is going to be the one that are going to be taking in these people. The United States, I'm sure, will not spare a penny when it comes to humanitarian efforts. Neither, I think, will Canada or other nations of the West. But it's a great question. How prepared are they for the influx of people and what those numbers may potentially look like? I mean, you're talking about millions of people who live in Ukraine.
Yeah. Okay, Anne-Marie, thank you for all your wonderful reporting all through the day. I'm afraid we're going to have to keep you on location. There's a lot tomorrow to come. That's our Washington correspondent. She is Anne-Marie Hordern. What we need today is a geopolitical expert, and fortunately, we have that in the person of Ian Bremmer. He is, of course, the founder and president of help me, Ian. G0 Media and Eurasia Group. Thanks a lot, Ian.
The Eurasia Group.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I still love you. Don't worry about it, my friend.
Thanks a lot. No, I apologize,
I was
Ian.
just going to let you flounder, but it's fine. You know I love you.
It's fine. It'd be like my wife. So, Ian, help me here on this. President Putin has made it pretty explicit exactly what he wants. He wants a new government in Kyiv, also demilitarize all of Ukraine. What is the likelihood he can actually achieve that end?
In the near term, he can absolutely achieve it because let's be clear, the Americans, the Europeans, the NATO allies are not going to put boots on the ground to defend Ukraine. They are not a NATO member. They do not have a membership action plan. The Ukrainians are brave. They will fight for their homeland. They will be overwhelmed. So, I mean, I don't know if it's a week or if it's 4 weeks, but the government will be gone. They will be either in exile or, dare I say it, worse. And there will be regime change in Ukraine. It looks to me like this is not a partition. It looks to me like it's the entirety of Ukraine on the basis of the bombing that we've seen already from Russia, which even includes the far west of Ukraine, which is, frankly, overwhelmingly Catholic, Ukrainian-speaking, no historical background with Russia. No one would make that argument, and yet that's, they're engaged in military strikes there. The question is, what are the implications of that? What are the costs? What does it mean for Russia and NATO relations going forward? This is an incredibly dangerous thing for them to be doing. And of course, also, how far do they go beyond Ukraine? I should mention to you, by the way, that there are Russian separatists from a breakaway republic in Moldova called Transnistria, who made their way to Moscow a couple of days ago, asking if Putin would recognize their independence. They didn't go without being ordered to do so by Putin. The Belarusians are changing their constitution on February 28th. It will no longer be neutral. It will no longer be non-nuclear. Will the Russians incorporate Belarus into Russian empire? Seems reasonably likely at this point. These are truly world-changing events that we are watching on a daily basis right now, David.
Ian, it's Joe Matthew. This morning's reporting at G0 suggests Vladimir Putin has much bigger plans to the point that you're now making. We're hearing reports of shelling in areas along the coast in the south that are still controlled by Kyiv. They're actually hearing concussions in the capital city. How far does this go? Does Vladimir Putin want to control all of Ukraine?
Yes, I think it's clear. Now, it is true that the Russian government has said that they don't want to occupy Ukraine, but they also said they didn't want to invade Ukraine for the last 4 weeks. Yeah. They lie. There's nothing diplomatically that should be believed about the Russian position right now. You do not set 200,000 troops up and amass that kind of firepower and then use it against a sovereign Ukrainian nation whose only sin is to want to exist independently, whose only sin is democracy and the right to vote for their own government. You don't deploy that kind of force and risk not just tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives, which will be lost, but also Russian soldiers who will come home to Russia in caskets. You don't do that unless you intend to overthrow this government. This is, for the foreseeable future, the end of an independent Ukraine.
You mentioned Moldova. Is that the key to entering from the west? Ian, you point out they've already come in from 3 directions that would complete the surrounding of Ukraine.
The Russians already have troops based in Transnistria. It's like the other breakaway republics, enclaves, like we saw the fight in Georgia back in 2008. You remember Abkhazia, Ossetia. It's, like Crimea in Ukraine, which had a Russian base on the ground, Sevastopol, even before 2014. That's what we're talking about here.
How long do you think it will take for Vladimir Putin to get those 200,000 troops then throughout the entire country of Ukraine? If that's the goal, he says he doesn't want to occupy the country, Ian, but how long would it take him to take it over?
I would say I'm not a military expert at all, but we certainly have them on payroll at Eurasia Group, and I would say between 1 and 4 weeks. Again, if you're not trying to maximize Russian casualties here, and you don't care about Ukrainian civilian deaths, then you talk much more about massive firepower from the air to degrade Ukrainian military capabilities to the greatest capacity, as well as cyber attacks. And then perhaps you do that well before you're throwing large numbers of troops on the ground. Keep in mind, the Ukrainians do have Javelin anti-tank systems. They're very effective against Russian tanks when they're stopped. That's going to lead to a lot of casualties. How much do they want to basically destroy the morale and the will of the Ukrainian soldiers, fighting forces, before they bring troops in? That's an open question right now.
Fascinating conversation that we were looking forward to with Ian Brennan. We thank you, Ian, for being with us on a special edition here of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, D.C. I'm joined, of course, by David Weston, who is with us at World Headquarters in New York. And it's a pleasure now to introduce Senator Sherrod Brown as we hear a senior voice from Capitol Hill on this. Democrat from Ohio. Senator, it's great to have you with us today on Bloomberg Television. The conversation about sanctions is one that lasted for weeks, maybe months would be a better way to put it, in the United States Senate. And it never happened. We ended with a binding resolution or a non-binding resolution, far from the mother of all sanctions that we expected from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Was that a failure on the part of the Congress?
No, I think there is almost unanimity on what we do. The only outliers right now that I can see are the few, extremist Trump senators that are following the former president's lead and cozying up to Putin and being, sorry, this language, being almost a Putin lapdog. We cringe, almost cringeworthy. Remember Trump and Putin and in Helsinki a few years ago, early in the Trump presidency, and we see that same kind of fondness, if you will, for Putin from Trump and a few of his acolytes. But serious-minded people in both parties understand the potential that Ian Bremmer just pointed out, that the biggest land war potentially since World War II, that is what gets Russia to stop, and that we will, these sanctions. I spoke with Secretary Yellen just 40 minutes ago. These are going to be very strong sanctions aimed at banks, at Russian oil companies, at the oligarchs' personal finances, the thugs around Putin, and their personal finances, and their profligate lives. They live all over Europe, and they target those sanctions there and target those sanctions in Putin personally. They will pay a major price for this. unfortunately, the world hurts while they do.
Senator, this is David Weston in New York. As you pointed out, a lot of the sanctions being imposed or talked about right now involve banks, but it's not just Russian banks. It also puts responsibilities on American and other Western banks. You are, of course, the chair of the Senate Banking and Urban Affairs and Housing Committee. Give us a sense of what U.S. banks need to do to be able to make sure they can comply with the sanctions. And by the way, how concerned are we about cyber attacks potentially from Russia against our banking system?
Well, we're always concerned about that. I assume, though, I think we can assume that those cyber attacks will accelerate now. Banks in this country, Wall Street and medium-sized, even smaller banks, and I talked to community bankers in Ohio too, are spend a lot of money to push back to protect against these cyber attacks. I know that Secretary Yellen is working. She is navigating her way through and working. I don't think negotiating is the right word. She's working with large American banks and large European banks who have some dealings with Russian banks. So they're going to be on board. They understand the importance of this. They understand that the Secretary of the Treasury and the leaders in Congress in both parties and the President of the United States understands the gravitas of this. They do too, and they know that their long-term needs and the long-term viability of who we are as a country, but the long-term viability of our international financial system depends on their cooperation.
Senator, we're just now hearing from the White House and want to let everyone know that we do expect to hear from President Biden at 1:30 p.m. Washington time. That's a bit later than we were first expecting. We will be bringing those remarks to you. And I wonder, Senator Brown, to what extent does Joe Biden need to prepare the American people for collateral economic damage? How do these sanctions impact the economy here in the U.S.?
Well, there's no question that will have impact. Europeans will have much more dramatic, deeper impact than we will, whether it's energy prices or just any kind of economic hit that they will get. But I think the president understands it. I think he'll explain it. I think the markets understand it. I think American consumers mostly will understand, but the president has an obligation to lay it out that this is a hit to the world economy. It can be softened because our economy is so strong. Just remember, Mr. Wessel, I think it was released last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, our economy grew for the first time in decades. Our economy has grown faster than China's. We've had 6 million jobs created in the last year. It's the best first year of a president in job creation and maybe in history. So we have a resilient, strong economy. We've got to deal with inflation, and this could contribute some to that. But Americans need to be prepared, and our government needs to be prepared too, and the president will discuss that, I'm sure.
Senator, we're all consumed, obviously, with the invasion of Ukraine, but there is also important business pending still up on Capitol Hill. Let me turn to those 5 Fed nominations that are pending before your banking committee, and specifically ask with respect to Sarah Bloom Raskin, which seems to be the problem at the moment, particularly from your ranking member, Senator Pat Toomey, asking for more clarifications, particularly from the Kansas City Fed. Are you working behind the scenes to sort of answer his questions to get this logjam broken?
Well, we're seeing something that I've never seen in the Banking Housing Committee, and I'm not sure I've ever seen it anywhere, where there's a boycott by one party to stop a vote because of the peculiar rules of the Senate. Because it's a 50-50 Senate, there was a quote-unquote power-sharing agreement between the two leaders. I won't get into details there. We can't vote on anything in the Senate, in a Senate committee, until there's a quorum, and a quorum means we have to have at least one member of the minority party. So essentially, the Republicans decided not to work that week, and they boycotted a meeting where we were gonna, I assume, confirm Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed. We're going to confirm Lael Brainerd, the vice chair of the Fed, and then 3 other Fed nominees. And I'm fine with Republicans voting no, but show up and work and vote on these 5. And I hear them say they didn't like the answers she gave to questions. She answered 185 written questions over a 48-hour period over a weekend, because that was what we had established to get these nominees going, these nominations moving forward. She then answered more questions after that. I mean, the ranking member didn't like the answers, but I didn't like the answers from some Trump nominees, but we didn't block a vote. because we voted no sometimes if you don't like the answers, that's fine. But you come to the Senate, you don't have three choices, yes, no, and I'm not going to work, I'm going to boycott. You either vote yes or no. That's what the public expects. We're going to have another meeting next Wednesday morning. I'm hopeful that Republicans show up. We vote on these. There may be a tie vote, 12-12. Then we'll take care of that when we get to the Senate floor and vote.
You heard it from Senator Sherrod Brown. Next Wednesday, Senator, Chair of the Banking Committee, we thank you for being with us on Balance of Power on an important day. Coming up, Kriti Gupta on the market's response, a pretty severe one to the situation in Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Wherever you get your news.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia. This is Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg Green.
On TV, radio, and the web, this is Bloomberg.
As a company grows, there are more challenges. What do you worry about the most?
The market opportunity for us is enormous, and so our challenge is to continue innovating, driving, and pushing ourselves every single day to go after the most attractive profit pools in this incredible global beauty and wellness market.
We have to be able to give our customers vehicles, that are their primary vehicles that are EVs. And to be able to do that, we need to have range and infrastructure, and we need to remove the pain points. And so that's what we're doing.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Markets have been reacting all day to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with commodities in particular in the spotlight. Kriti Gupta is here with the story. So commodities, how about that?
Yeah, it's a down day for the stock market. Usually you seem to see when the stock market drops, the oil market drops as well, commodities especially. But right now you're actually seeing the oil market really rally higher in a very big way. We're looking at Brent with a 103 handle, WTI at 96. What's important is not just the fact that oil has crossed $100 a barrel, but the fact that the spread between the Brent benchmark and the WTI benchmark, essentially the international versus the U.S., the spread is $6 to $7. That is not something you even saw during the trade war, which is really tells you the depth of the geopolitical premium that's kind of baked into commodities right now. But it's not just oil. You're seeing this happen with the haven bid for gold, of course, wheat, natural gas, aluminum, nickel. Remember, Russia makes a good chunk of the world's commodity exports. So you're seeing this really show up in a big way. The idea that it's not just about can Russia or will Russia supply to the rest of the world, but simply the fact that this new invasion into Ukraine really shuts down a lot of the transportation, a lot of the logistics, the pipelines, and of course that's going to show up in gasoline prices here at home, which brings it back to the politics of it all. The fact that gasoline prices are $3.54, getting closer to that key $4 level the analysts look for when we're talking about demand destruction.
And not good for the administration. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for that report on commodities in particular. Coming up, former Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and Blue Voyant CEO Jim Rosenthal are here about their company to fight cybersecurity threats, which are particularly in the news today with that invasion of Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Mexico has become a heaven for crypto enthusiasts in the capital of San Juan, where crypto ATMs are becoming easier to come by. Here is one in the street of Condado del Mar, just a few steps from the beach. During the pandemic, the island saw an influx of wealthy foreigners buying residential property to avoid mainland U.S. taxes, such as the YouTuber Logan Paul, who bought a multi-million-dollar mansion in 2021. Many Puerto Ricans are protesting that cryptocurrency and real estate investors are what their modern-day colonizers look like. Once these visitors become permanent residents, they pay zero tax on capital gains, dividends, and interest, which is why the island is particularly attractive to holders of cryptocurrencies. Now, with little government intervention, Puerto Ricans fear being displaced from their homes.
Front Row, exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg Terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside David Weston in New York. Keeping you up to date now with news from around the world. Here's First Word with Mark Crumpton. Mark.
Joe, thank you very much. As we've been reporting, Russian military forces have invaded Ukraine. They're in the nation's northern region, including the capital, according to officials there. A Russian lawmaker says the intent is to ensure a pro-Moscow government, pushing out any U.S. influence. The government in Kyiv has declared martial law and has asked for international support. President Biden is threatening further sanctions and is set to speak after a virtual meeting with other G7 leaders. In a national address, French President Emmanuel Macron said that sanctions against Russia will be military and economic, and they will include the energy sector.
The events of last night are a turning point in the history of Europe and our country. They will have lasting, profound consequences on our lives. The sanctions against Russia will match the level of aggression.
President Macron added that action will be taken after talks with allies at the Group of 7 European Union and NATO summits. And the Russian invasion is jeopardizing the chances of getting an agreement with Iran on its nuclear program. World powers at the negotiating table are now on opposite sides of Europe's biggest security crisis since World War II. Envoys have suggested a successful conclusion to the talks could be just days away, but the United States and Iran still have to resolve some key differences. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Cybersecurity is one of the major concerns in Russia's attack on Ukraine, which makes what firms like Blue Voyant do all the more relevant on a day like today. It's a unicorn firm that has just received a $250 million capital infusion from investors, including former Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin's Liberty Media. And we welcome now the former Treasury Secretary, along with Blue Voyant CEO Jim Rosenthal. So welcome, gentlemen. Congratulations on the deal. Let me start with you, Jim. Explain why Blue Voyant is different from other cybersecurity firms.
Well, thank you. Blue Voyant specializes in two things. We provide internal defense of their networks for companies that can use our expertise and talent and technology to best defend themselves. We also provide external defense of their supply chains because well-defended companies are still often hit through attacks routed through their supply chains.
So, Mr. Secretary, this seems like a pretty crowded field at this point. A lot of people are getting into it. What made you choose this one to invest in?
Well, let me just say, in general, we're very focused on cybersecurity and national security. This is our fourth investment in the space, and we view this as very complementary to our other investments. Jim's built a business that we believe is best in class, and we think it's a terrific opportunity. We also think that the current events just highlight how important it is for every country, every company to be protected and have best-in-class cybersecurity tools.
Jim, we're meeting here on an interesting day to be talking, as David pointed out, about cybersecurity. Is the news driving business? Are headlines that we're seeing coming from Ukraine, from Russia, from Eastern Europe, where cyber attacks have become, in some cases, a daily event? Is that driving demand? Is it increasing orders for the company?
Well, it's doing two things. The first is it's making our services all the more needed. And secondly, it's for our existing clients. We're able to, provide reassurance that they're being protected in the best possible way. Look, the Russians have got really advanced cyber capabilities, both at the state level and in their criminal groups. And therefore, critical infrastructure in particular needs to be very careful and needs to raise their defenses to very high levels.
Mr. Secretary, I know you're not in the government anymore, but you know about these things. Have we seen an uptick in some of the cyber attacks emanating from perhaps Russia?
I think we've had, that's the intelligence we've been getting from all of our portfolio companies. When I was in government, I was responsible for cybersecurity for all of financial services, and I would say that's an industry that Jim knows well and is pretty well protected, either pretty well or very well protected. But many other industries have not taken this as seriously as financial services and need to do so.
Secretary, I'm curious your thought on the proper response from the U.S. to cyber attacks. We've had members of Congress, members of the Senate on this program, including Mark Warner, suggest that a cyber attack that crossed the border into one of our allied nations would, in fact, be the possible trigger for an Article 5 response. As someone who has spent time in the executive branch, is that how you see it? Could a cyber attack, in fact, be considered or should be considered an act of war?
I think it could be, although I would say that I think the details have to be reviewed very carefully. Many times, cyber attacks come from nation states, but they also come from non-nation state actors. But I think there's no question the U.S. is very well prepared on cybersecurity itself, but industry needs to make sure it's protected just as well. And the good news is there are great tools out there. Jim uses many of these best-in-class tools, and there's many things that companies can do to protect themselves.
Mr. Secretary, we're just under an hour away, we believe, from hearing from President Biden, in which he no doubt will address the question of sanctions. When you were Treasury Secretary, you obviously oversaw sanctions. Give us your sense of what is effective and what is not so effective. And let me be more specific. There seems to be a question now about possibly cutting off Russia from the SWIFT payment system, with the UK saying, yeah, it's a good idea, Germany not so much.
Well, let me just say, many of these issues we were dealing with 2 years ago. The chancellor was previously the finance minister, and I was negotiating with him on Nord Stream 2 years ago about making sure that they had energy independence, that they had access to U.S. LNG, that they had access through Ukraine. So these are not new issues. Now, I have heard President Biden say that he's going to respond with very strong sanctions. I hope that does include SWIFT. If I were in the seat today, that's what I would be recommending to the president. And I think it's time that we now cut off Russia from the U.S. dollar system.
Jim, when it comes to nation states as opposed to rogue actors, who's on the cutting edge? Who's the greater threat when it comes to cyber? Is it Russia or China?
The cutting edge includes both of them. In terms of cyber capabilities, Russia and China have got the most advanced nation-state capabilities. And we need to, in this case, be very concerned because Russia both has some of the most advanced capabilities in the world, but they also have got a different and greater risk tolerance than most countries. And they're willing, therefore, to take advantage of those capabilities in ways that others would be hesitant to.
Thank you so much to Stephen Mnuchin. He's former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Liberty Strategic Capital founder and managing partner, and to Jim Rosenthal. He's Blue Voyant CEO. Coming up here, he's a retired four-star general and former director of the CIA. We'll be joined by General David Petraeus to get his perspective on Russia's assault on Ukraine and what impact it may have on NATO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside David Weston in New York. Former CIA Director and U.S. Army General David Petraeus joins us now as we follow headlines that are coming from Ukraine. In general, I want to thank you for joining us on a very busy day here as we keep an eye on what is happening and how much we know now versus the many conflicting reports that are coming out of Ukraine in a chaotic time. You were a division commander of the 101st Airborne during the invasion of Iraq. Based on what you're seeing now, as Russia enters Ukraine from the north, from the east, from the south, how far does this go? What is Russia's aim?
Well, the aim right now appears pretty clear to be to topple the government, perhaps even capture the government, President Zelensky, replace it with a pro-Russian regime, control the capital, and it appears take control of everything east of the Dnieper, which sort of bisects the country, and also take the southern portion of the country so that it cuts Ukraine off from the Black Sea, and thereby they take control of the major ports of Odessa and Mariupol. That also connects them up with a Russian unit that just happens to be in the eastern part of Moldova to the west of Ukraine. Whether they continue to take all of the rest of the country is not entirely clear now, although it is clear that they have been shelling or bombing even Lviv in the far western part of the country, which indicates at least that that could be a follow-on phase. And what really, I think everything depends on right now is whether Ukrainian forces, who will be overwhelmed, they're not going to be able to stop the Russian tanks and personnel carriers. Russia has complete air supremacy, not just superiority. The question is, are they going to surrender, or will they continue to fight? In other words, just pull back into the woods. It's a vast country. Russia cannot clear all of these areas at all. And as the tanks go by, sooner or later, the logistical convoys have to appear behind them. And that's where these forces can make an impact, the Ukrainian forces, if the partisan brigades fight in the cities and make it very miserable. You know, our concern, in fact, in invading Iraq was the logistical lines. You know, we moved very rapidly. There was more fighting, I think, than people actually realized from afar. But there was not much the Iraqi forces could do to stop us. The concern was, could they ambush our fuel convoys, our ammunition resupply convoys, all the rest of that? And that was a major concern. We were fortunate that they were unable to do that. We cleared those. We kept them clear. And that was a much smaller, more compact battlefield and a population. You know, Ukraine is at least 50% larger in terms of population and much larger in terms of space as well.
So, General, this is David Weston in New York. That leads me to the question of timeline here, because in Iraq, as you say, it was a fairly compressed timeline until the regime fell. President Putin has said his goal here is to topple the government in Kyiv. How long can the Russians keep up the effort?
Well, they can sustain the effort as long as, again, the Ukrainians can't completely cut off their logistics. This is, at a certain point, it becomes all about logistics. It becomes about refueling the tanks, rearming them if they're having to use up a lot of ammunition. Same for the artillery, the personnel carriers for the soldiers. At a certain point, you know, can they feed them as well and the rest? Certainly they can get some of that from local communities if possible. But as they overstretch or perhaps overstretch, the question is, how vulnerable will those supply lines be? And in particular, how much will the Ukrainian forces continue to fight once they have been penetrated, bypassed, in some cases encircled? And that's what I think everyone is trying to divine right now from every source available, by the way, from TikTok, from Twitter, from these open source aggregators and so forth. And so far, it is clear they've knocked down a Russian helicopter. Apparently, they've knocked out some of their armored vehicles, a few here and there. But it's not yet crystal clear how tough the Ukrainian resistance is at this point.
General, are there things the United States could do who could support the resistance in Ukraine, or are we doors combat at this point?
I think at this point, until, again, the situation stabilizes, they have what they have. I mean, you're not going to fly anything into Ukraine at this moment in time. The Ukrainian forces who might be on the receiving end of anything we might send additionally, they're pretty occupied right now. So this is where it was hugely important that we flew in dozens of C-17 wide-body aircraft full of Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger air defense systems, and some of the other NATO countries, UK in particular, did as well. But again, they now are fighting with what it is they have in their hands. This is not the time to introduce something new to them, nor do we want to fly something into Ukrainian airspace, given the Russian air supremacy and the possibility of a mistake. What we are doing, of course, though, and I suspect we'll hear even more about that from the president when he speaks from the White House, will be more reinforcements of what will be frontline countries, two of which already are frontline countries, two of the Baltic states that have a border with Russia, a third which may have a border with Russia in the future, And it does actually as long as Russia occupies Belarus. And then you can have some more. Eastern Poland is, again, border with Ukraine. You'll have the entire eastern Polish border will be, again, perhaps the new Cold War front line. So certainly reinforcing the new frontline states of NATO will be very important. And I think we'll see more and more and more about that. And the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe may call up the ready force of NATO and so forth.
General, we heard from the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, speaking earlier today. Here's what he had to say.
Today, Russia started an invasion in Ukraine. Putin started a war with Ukraine, with the democratic world. He wants to destroy my country and our state, everything that we have built, everything we live for.
General Petraeus, it was an impassioned speech. I wonder what kind of resistance you think the Russian forces will face. To your point, once they have gone past cities and even encircled areas of Ukraine, we've seen civilians training on the weekends. We've seen family members carrying guns in advance of this. What should Russia be prepared to face?
Well, again, we have heard rhetorical resistance. We've seen, again, this weekend training and so forth. Yeah. Now you see what really happens. Again, it's one thing to talk about it. It's quite another to take a rifle in your hands and become a partisan or a guerrilla.
Right.
But we'll see. I have been impressed by the resistance that is online, that is in social media, that is, even people sending emails from inside Ukraine that sound very determined. If that turns into real determination, again, with weapons in hands, that can make Russian life very, very miserable. Again, keep in mind, 190,000 troops is not that many for an enormous country, keeping in mind that most of those 190,000 troops aren't really boots on the ground. When you strip out all the different, the tankers, the artillery, the logistics, all of these others, and then you actually get down to the infantrymen who will actually be responsible for holding areas and doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a long period of time. There are a lot of vulnerabilities. And of course, we experienced that in Iraq as well, as a result, in some cases, of some policy decisions that turned parts of Iraq against us and so forth. When that insurgency and the extremist elements materialized, that was a very formidable challenge.
General Petraeus, always a great pleasure to have you with us. It was very helpful. That's General David Petraeus. Coming up, as Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine, excuse me, we get the view from Washington. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
City. We're in London, in Sydney, in San Francisco.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening. So recap the headlines.
You do not want to miss this story.
How are you thinking about those dynamics?
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Jeannie Shanzano is our political contributor. She's from Iona College, and she joins us now as we preview what we're going to hear from President Biden at 1:30 Eastern Time. And I'm joined, of course, by my colleague in Washington. He is Joe Matthew. So, Jeannie, what are we expecting to hear from the president shortly?
You know, I think a number of things. You know, first and foremost, you know, how the United States and its allies are going to respond in terms of sanctions. And he has said they would be swift, they would be severe. You've been talking about those all hour. We expect that, number one. I also think it's going to be critically important for President Biden to explain to Americans why this matters. You know, I have just gotten off of a class in which I'm talking to young people who were not even born during 9/11. So for them, talk about the Cold War and sort of what this means and why it matters to them is really important. And I think President Biden's got to talk about why Americans are going to have to sustain this pain at the pump potentially and other sort of fallout that we may see as Americans as a result of these sanctions as this continues.
Jeannie, this is a critically important speech that the president will be delivering not only to Americans, but to the world in just about a half hour's time. And of course, we will bring that to you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. But he has arguably an even more important speech next week. That would be the State of the Union. And as you prepare for our coverage next Tuesday night, I wonder what you make of the changing narrative and whether it's time to crinkle on the speech that's already been written and start from scratch based on what's happened in the last week.
Yeah, you know, I wouldn't want to be this speechwriter who's got to keep up with sort of breaking events here, but I think you're right. To a certain extent, you know, this does change maybe what the president was intending to talk about. Let's not forget, this is a president who came to office wanting to pivot to Asia, and he has been pulled right back to, you know, sort of what Mitt Romney warned about many years ago, the threat from Russia. So I do think he's going to address that. I do, to a certain extent, also think this fits in with his key narrative on foreign policy, which is that democracy has to prevail over autocracy. This is part and parcel of that message, as is his intention and his statement over and over again to, you know, sort of restore normalcy on the world stage after it was upended, as he sees it, by his predecessor. So I think those two themes are going to play a part in the State of the Union as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure how soon we'll get back to normalcy on the world stage, Jeannie. It's a nice aspiration. But I also wonder...
Not anymore, David.
But is he also having to ride the horse in two different directions? On the one hand, he really put a lot of premium behind what he called social infrastructure, things like childcare and things like that. Does that come up a little tilt right now, given what's going on in Europe?
It does. It makes it very difficult. You know, as he wanted to focus on, say, build back better and the soft or the human infrastructure, as we like to call it, very difficult to imagine him spending as much time as he would have wanted to, given events going on in Europe, and also given inflation and how that could be impacted going forward by whatever sanctions they decide to impose. So I think it does make that more difficult.
Okay, thanks so much to Jeannie Shanzano. She's our political contributor, and she's from Iona College. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second, Joe and I will talk to a variety of people, once again, about Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
this going to primarily be chips for your own business, or is this going to be more centered around the foundry business and external customers?
It's going to be both. And what we said today is we're announcing 2 fab modules. It's a large location, 1,000 acres, because I'd hope to build out a full 8 fabs or more on this location. And, if we do that full project, it would be $100 billion over the course of the decade or so. So a massive project, initially 3,000 jobs, 7,000 construction workers, supply chain, et cetera. I mean, this is just fabulous. And the products will be our most leading edge chips. So as we said, this will be the angstrom era when we're going to 2 nanometers and below into the angstrom era. So it'll be the most advanced chips, potentially the largest manufacturing location in the world. We'll use its output for our internal products, but also for those of the foundry customers as well. So it's going to cover both.
How difficult was it to go to investors and say, invest, give money, put money into a travel tech company within this environment?
It wasn't that difficult because TravelPerk is doing much, much better than the rest of the industry. In fact, we are at the moment growing at 4 times revenue of pre-COVID numbers.
Live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Markets The Close. I'm Caroline Hyde.
I'm Romaine Boston.
And I'm Kaylee Lines. And it begins the long-anticipated invasion of Ukraine, triggering one of the worst security crises in Europe since World War II. Russian President Vladimir Putin vowing to demilitarize Ukraine, adding that the assault was targeted at people he said have taken Ukraine hostage. President Biden is set to speak this hour as the U.S. and its allies look to punish Russia's economy, its financial sector, with sanctions. Now, as we count you down to the United States close, we dig into the geopolitical, the economic, the investing ramifications of this invasion. Romaine, we've got to look at the market implications.
The market reaction has been pretty severe. We opened lower on the S&P 500 by about 1.6%, and we were down as much as 2.6%. At some point, we did see some dip buyers come back into this market, but not nearly enough to push us back into the green. Lower on the day by about 1% on the S&P. The NASDAQ, which was down as much as 3%, is actually now somewhere near that waterline, but most of the damage is done here. Sentiment definitely on the back foot. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index up 1% here on the day. In fact, this is going to be one of those days where we're going to talk a lot about the superlatives of the worst day since 2020, the best day since 2020. It's going to be a lot of that today. As far as Russia stocks, well, you're looking at the worst day ever there for the benchmark Russian index, down 33% here on the day. And then I thought this was interesting. Over there in Europe, the ERIXP, this is an index that basically tracks renewable energy stocks in Europe on a day where we're looking at natural gas prices over in Europe go through the roof, up as much as 50%, oil prices, coal prices, everything to do with energy. And now people are looking to wind stocks, solar stocks, seeing if there's any reprieve for the folks over there in Europe from the tensions going on at the Ukraine.
Well, and on the subject of energy and on the subject of superlatives, Romaine, oil also one we have to watch today, sitting at its highest since the summer of 2014. We are at triple digits on Brent crude. Yes, off of session highs, but still trading just under $103 a barrel. And even WTI, the benchmark here in the U.S., got a taste of triple digits earlier today. It's now trading at $96.30. But that, with gas prices, as you say, soaring in Europe, all adds to this inflationary narrative. One of the ripple effects of this geopolitical situation we are facing that is going to impact central banks and also impact the U.S. president when he addresses the nation later on today. He is going to address the situation in Ukraine, but also probably has to speak to the domestic audience, the American people, about how they may feel this when it comes to prices at the gas pump. Let's get to Bloomberg White House reporter Jordan Fabian, who is standing by for us. Jordan, how does the president walk that line today?
That's one of the toughest challenges that President Biden faces in trying to confront this situation. On one hand, you have the strategy the U.S. has pursued so far, which is threatening sanctions on Russia to try and deter Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine. That hasn't worked, so the incentive would be to ratchet up those penalties. But on the other hand, as you just mentioned, ratcheting up sanctions could have an effect on American consumers who are already struggling with inflation if they happen to hit the banking sector or critical exports from Russia. So we'll have to wait and see what Biden announces, but that's a tough tightrope that this administration is walking right now.
And of course, we'll be listening now for any update on those sanctions. Also, people want to know, Jordan, if there is going to be any shift in policy with regards to the military response.
The White House has made it pretty clear that they don't intend to send U.S. troops into Ukraine. That being said, there has been coordination with NATO allies in Eastern Europe, like Lithuania and Poland, who are understandably nervous about the situation that's happening on their borders. The U.S. has already boosted troop levels in both of those countries, and top defense officials have been consulting about what to do if the violence happens to spill over. But the broader picture is, this is a really extraordinary move by Putin that threatens the prospect of a broader war in Europe, like likes of we haven't seen in decades.
Jordan, Fabian, thank you for the update. Of course, our Bloomberg White House reporter. And as we await that all-important speech from President Biden, we also take in the response from Europe already coming thick and fast. We want to talk through that with our Brussels Bloomberg Europe correspondent Maria Tadeo. And we've heard reactions from the United Kingdom. We've had sanctions elevated there. What is the reaction in Europe now?
Well, Caroline, I think before we get to the reaction, we need to look at what is the situation in Ukraine. This is now clearly a full invasion of the country. We know there's heavy fighting in East Ukraine. There's heavy fighting in the south of the country. And we've seen troops moving very clearly from Belarus into the capital of Kyiv. That is the next big battleground. And the information that we have from the Ukrainian foreign minister is that they believe there will be a big night of fighting around the capital. The capital is Kyiv, as you know, because that is where the Ukrainian president sits. And the Russians have made it clear they want this government out. When it comes to the reaction from the European Union, well, we're going to hear from European leaders in about 2 weeks. They say they're working very closely with NATO and the United States to put together what they say will be the mother of all sanctions. Is that going to be enough to deter Vladimir Putin? Well, it's unclear. And what we've seen is that at this point, he's not acting like a rational leader. This goes beyond. And again, I would point to an essay he wrote last year in which he said, for me, an independent Ukraine that is separated from Russia would be an abomination. Now we see that he's making good on that.
Well, and it raises a question, Maria, of what good sanctions will do, which brings me to the use of force. On the subject of NATO, will they be moving any boots on the ground?
On Ukraine, and this is a very important point to make, Ukraine is not a member of NATO and it had no perspective over the short term to join NATO. When Vladimir Putin says he felt threatened by Ukraine joining NATO, what we know is that there was no timeline for NATO to join or accept Ukraine. So we're not going to see any fighting from NATO troops or American troops, by the way, in Ukraine at this point. This is a war that they know they're going to have to fight for themselves, and this is why the Ukrainian president today, once again, repeating, almost begging, please, we need weapons. We need NATO to facilitate more weapons and to go for a big sanctions package on Russia. It's the only way we're going to be able to put up a fight.
All right, Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo working a long day in Brussels for us. Thank you so much. Now let's turn our attention back to the markets. Wall Street trying to come to grips with the geopolitical tensions and everything happening in Ukraine. eToro global market strategist Ben Laidler writing this morning. This is a triple hit to the global economy with a toxic combination of higher inflation, lower economic growth, and greater uncertainty. The only silver lining is growth is strong, a buffer to any slowdown, and policymakers and investors already prepared for high inflation. For more market reaction, we welcome Nancy Tengler, Laffer Tengler Investments Chief Investment Officer and CEO. Nancy, given all of that, given this was a market already hedged in a lot of ways, already prepared for inflation, have you had to move any money around today?
Not today, Kaylee. Thanks so much for having me. We've been anticipating not this, but a slowdown in growth and a shift away from the growth at any price stocks to growth at a reasonable price. So we've been making our moves over the last 3 months. And, you know, you're never 100% happy with your portfolio. Being a portfolio manager is like being in a perpetual state of dissatisfaction. But we are pretty content with where we are. And interestingly, our riskier portfolios are actually up today. and just reflecting the strength in the NASDAQ, which is coming back quite strong right now. So I think it's a really interesting scenario, and perhaps an indication that people think the Fed won't be able to raise as much as they had expected.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the NASDAQ. It was interesting to see that there clearly was a threshold where some people thought that maybe valuations had gotten a little bit too far away from at least the perceived reality for a lot of folks in this market. There is still a lot of talk here, Nancy, about the economic ramifications, the ripple effects of the Russian invasion and whatever the response is by Western nations here. Are we prepared here in this country to deal with those economic ramifications, recession?
I don't think we are, Romaine. I mean, I do think this is analogous to 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. We were already in a recession. It just exacerbated the recession. I don't believe we're in a recession right now, but I think the smartest thing we could do as a nation, the best sanction that we could put on Russia is to open up our energy markets. So, you know, re-engage the XL pipeline, renew the leases that have been stalled by the administration, and produce in a way that would bring oil prices down. I mean, we have the capability. We were energy independent and a net exporter just over a year ago. So I think that the timing of the FERC rulings on pipelines was just really poorly informed. And we only need to look at Germany to see what having a weak energy policy does for national security. And I would just point out, we love renewables, but climate change can wait a couple of months to get us through this period so that Americans don't have to suffer anymore and we send a strong message to Russia.
Talk to us, therefore. I'm looking at an energy index down on the day. Energy has been the only outperforming sector really on the year thus far, Nancy. You say that your risk-on investments are doing well today. Longer term, are we still going to see the cyclical trade, this move into energy stocks?
Well, we're overweight energy, Caroline, and it's good to have you back. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that trade is over yet, but I think at the margin, when you look at the valuations on some of the productivity drivers that I talk about often when I'm on your show, and our three favorites are cybersecurity, which is up big for obvious reasons today, and then the cloud providers and sort of the innards of the cloud, and then semis. I think you're going to be glad you owned those, and you have an opportunity to affect your portfolio much more because oil is such a small portion of the S&P weighting. Even if you're double weighted, you don't have much exposure from an overall portfolio standpoint. So we like the names. We've added to some in the last 3 months. We've added to materials, but we've also added to some of those tech names like Adobe and Microsoft and ServiceNow that are driving future productivity gains, because I think that's going to be the real story as the economy slows.
Nancy, just quickly here, there's the cyclical play on a sector level. There's also a cyclical play on a regional level, and we've been hearing a chorus of people saying they are turning towards Europe. In this kind of environment, with now war in Eastern Europe, how do you think the U.S. will perform relative to places like it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kaylee. Interestingly, we've actually been taking our clients out of the global markets at the margin. I mean, we still have some exposure, but our feeling is we'd much rather be here where we can control and understand the variables. I mean, clearly we're impacted by the rest of the world, but I really don't want to own many regions around the globe and take that kind of risk for our clients, particularly with a strengthening dollar. So we're light. I think you should focus on U.S. companies that, you know, have pricing power and are growing their dividends. I mean, Home Depot raised dividend 15%, FANG 20%. We saw UPS at 49%. Those are the best hedges against inflation, and that's where we're focused.
All right, Nancy Tengler, Laffer Tengler Investments Chief Investment Officer and CEO, thank you so much for your time. And coming up, we'll continue the conversation on geopolitics and speak to Oksana Antonenko of Control Risks Group, which focuses on analyzing political and security risks in private and public sectors globally to discuss the impact of Russia's invasion. This is Bloomberg.
jobs for its highly skilled elite. Complicated, uncertain taxes have pushed most foreign companies in need of cheap labor towards China. That's costing the economy an estimated $140 billion a year.
They've been saying they're open to the rest of the world, but there are still a lot of protectionist barriers on doing business with India.
To follow in China's footsteps and reach the government's goal of being a $5 trillion economy by 2025, India needs to create a model which succeeds both at home and abroad.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The questions about risks, for example, those issues around macroeconomics, when you think about the healthcare scare, cyber continues to be one that's very expensive as you've had much more digitization and expenditure in the digital space.
Tuesday night, March 1st.
We are ready to respond decisively.
Bloomberg brings you live coverage of the State of the Union address.
America is back to work.
Hosted by Joe Matthew.
Inflation is kind of the #1 talking point so far.
Reaction, analysis, and what it means for Wall Street.
He did leave this door open. Those are the words Democrats wanted to hear.
Biden may get a little bit of a lift on this.
The State of the Union address, followed by the Republican response. Coverage begins Tuesday night at 8:30 Eastern.
We will continue on a remorseless mission to squeeze Russia from the global economy piece by piece, day by day, and week by week. And we will, of course, use Britain's position in every international forum to condemn the onslaught against Ukraine.
All right, some tough talk there from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but the question is, does that talk actually matter? Do sanctions, the sanctions packages that we're hearing from the UK, from the US and other nations, will that have a material impact on President Putin's next move? Oksana Antonenko, she's a director of global risk analysis over at the Control Risk Group. She advises a lot of companies, governments, and other investors on crisis management in Europe and Eurasia. Oksana, let's start off here with the question on everyone's mind is that after years and years of sanctions from Western governments against Putin and his allies, do they matter anymore to him?
Well, there will be time when we're all going to be looking back and thinking, whether the strategy that the West has been adopting in the run-up to this invasion of using sanctions as a primary deterrent actually worked. I think clearly we see now that it hasn't changed Putin's calculation. Clearly he has sanction-proofed to a large extent his economy, and for him personally, because we have to, of course, remember that his primary objective is not the health of Russian economy, or Russia's competitiveness, or degree of Russia's integration in the global economy. This is what Boris Johnson was talking about. His objective is to save his own power. And for him, the more Russia isolated from the global economy, the more Russia dependent on its own state and on its own self-sufficiency, the more his power is likely to persist. So when we see the new sanctions now, of course, they will hit the Russian economy hard. But the big question is whether it will hit Putin's power. And so far, we have not really seen any evidence that it is going to deter him, at least in the short run. He accumulated 620 billion of reserves. He has managed to disconnect Russia largely from the international economy already. And the Russian economy is now dominated by the state. So in a sense, sanctions for him is not a major challenge in the short run. In the medium run, is a different story.
Oksana, I like that you sort of talk about the way in which Russia has insulated itself basically from the global markets. Is there anything, I'm hearing and reading so much about isolating them out of the US dollar, or in particular SWIFT, in the messaging service, of course, to enable cross-national transactions to occur. Would that in any way limit him, given that people have said that could reduce GDP to the extent of 5%?
No, absolutely. The financial sanctions, sanctions against Russia's systemic banks, the payment disconnecting from payment system or even from the dollar only, those sanctions will send a massive shock for the Russian economy, for the Russian private sector in particular. But, Russia still essentially is a country dependent on, raw materials exports, on oil and gas exports, or exports of rare metals and other raw materials. And as long as it is able to export those materials, oil and gas externally and receive revenues from it, clearly it is not something which is going to cripple Russian economy immediately. And as I mentioned before, it will, of course, hurt Russian banking sector, the private sector. But, most of the Russian economy is now dominated by the state. And unless, President Biden can, manage to create a global coalition which will stop, Russia receiving its revenues from energy. And we know, of course, that Europe is still very dependent. It will not hurt Russian economy sufficiently to change Putin's calculus, I'm afraid.
So if it doesn't change Putin's calculus, Oksana, what is the risk posed to the rest of Eastern Europe, to the rest of the Baltics?
Well, I think at the moment, the risk, immediate risk, is only in terms of spillovers from, Ukraine crisis. If Putin indeed now has plans for occupying the entire territory of Ukraine, we are likely to see a very prolonged war, very bloody war with a lot of casualties, which is likely to stretch from eastern Ukraine all the way to the borders of Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and other EU countries. So we are likely to see, of course, a very large outflow of refugees. Some estimates suggest that maybe millions, but certainly in tens and hundreds of thousands. And then the big question is whether fighting in the west of Ukraine would indeed spill over into the neighboring countries. And we, of course, also seen, massive cyber attacks today. And will Putin use the cyber attacks to target, the countries in Eastern Europe and Baltic states? He's done that before.
Oksana, fascinating. And already we see the ripple effects. Hungarian forint off by 3.5%, Polish zloty also off by 3.5% on the day. Oksana Antonenko, we thank you so much. Control Risk Group. Romain, I know you have a point.
And we should just point out, too, she made a great point about whether the West can really divorce itself from that oil and gas. Today, here on the Bloomberg, we got our reports of the flow of gas through those pipelines out of Ukraine, out of Russia, into some of those European nations. They're still at the same levels they were prior to the invasion.
Very good point. The fact that we, at the moment, haven't seen any curtailing of commodities, but the market is a forward-looking basis of prices, and it's there that we see the stress. 50% increase in gas prices when traded over in the Netherlands, over in the UK at the moment. Still ahead, we're going to be diving into the geopolitical element of this, with China as well refusing to currently condemn Russia's attack on Ukraine, instead actually urging restraint by all parties. We are going to be digging into the China-Russia relationship. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.
Exclusive interviews with the most influential figures in finance. Lloyd Blankfein.
Deflation is a terrible thing. Inflation you could tolerate.
Kathy Wood.
Tesla will be in the pole position to dominate.
Jeremy Grantham.
We've had a very, very abnormal honeymoon Goldilocks period.
First available on the Bloomberg terminal, then on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg.com. Front Row, the best seats in the house for business's greatest minds.
The capital markets can really help the shift to sustainable and decarbonized global economy. What are you noticing in that as ESG is now the buzzword literally everywhere?
It is definitely the topic of conversation in most meetings I have with company CEOs, with investors, with industry groups. It's amazing.
Welcome back to our special coverage of Bloomberg Markets The Close, as we, of course, continue to see the evolution of, well, now a full-on scale attack from Russia into Ukraine. China currently refusing to condemn Russia's invasion, instead urging restraint by all parties. We want to get a sort of check on where the geopolitics stands in all of this worldwide. Bloomberg New Economy Forum editorial director is back from China, Andy Brown. Of course, he covered China for 2 decades, just got back from the Olympics, covering their very extraordinary environment, I'm sure. And talk to us about the ripple effects here. First and foremost, the relationship between Russia and China seems to only have been deepening.
Right. I think, first of all, we have to remember that Vladimir Putin's assault on the Ukraine flies in the face of every single one of China's most cherished foreign policy principles: respect for state sovereignty, mutual respect, non-aggression, win-win solutions. And yet China has now tethered itself to this increasingly unhinged autocrat in Moscow. And it finds itself right now in an impossible position. Hence, all it can do is what you just mentioned, which is mouth these platitudes about the need for diplomatic solutions and deflect all the blame on the United States for allegedly fanning the flames of war.
Well, give us a sense of why that tether is even there. Is it just geographic? Is there a political calculus? Is there an economic benefit here?
There's certainly no economic benefit for China in what Vladimir Putin is doing, to the extent that it drives a dagger through the heart of globalization, economic globalization. Nobody in the world has benefited more than China from economic globalization. It's the world's second largest economy. It has interest all over the world, including in Ukraine, billions of dollars of investment. Ukraine is China's largest trading partner. But on a broader level, China has an interest in global stability. It wants to push back against the United States. It believes democracies are on their last legs. It believes that the future is autocracies. But basically, China wants stability. And basically, Vladimir Putin wants to use brute force and violence to break apart the global order. China wants to shape the global order, wants to rewrite the rules. It doesn't want no rules.
China.
I'm just sorry. Can I just jump in? Why am I to believe that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are different?
They have a lot in common. They're both authoritarian figures. They both want to revive the ancient glory or the glories of their country's past. And for Vladimir Putin, that means reassembling the USSR in some shape or form. And an important component of Xi's aspiration is to recover Taiwan. So you can see that there are parallels right there. But Xi's challenge in recovering Taiwan, orders of magnitude more difficult than Ukraine.
All right, Andy, great to catch up with you. Always wonderful insights from Andy Brown, Bloomberg New Economy Forum editorial director. And we should point out to our viewers, this is an extended edition of Bloomberg Markets to Close. Of course, our eyes right now on the situation with Russia and the Ukraine, and more importantly, the response from Western nations. We are waiting to hear from the President of the United States as to what that response will be. We have a whole host of other guests that we're going to talk to later in this hour, including Michael Schau. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg.
heard of quantitative easing. That's when central banks buy securities to help keep financial conditions stable. But in 2022, that could all get kicked into reverse as central banks such as the Federal Reserve prepare to start reducing their balance sheets in a process called quantitative tightening. Strategists are still split on what the impact might be, but they're pointing to steeper yield curves and more pressure on risk assets. Greenflation. Inflation is all we've been talking about. But here's one with a new twist: greenflation. ECB policymaker Isabel Schnabel said that measures such as a carbon tax could boost inflation in the euro area. And as for markets, they're betting on it, with commodity-focused hedge funds seeking to capitalize on the decarbonization push. Breaking out China. China has been a synonym for emerging market investing, with Chinese companies making up around half of key stock indices. But could it become the new Japan? Bond and stock portfolio managers are looking to carve out China from their investments, seeking to make the most of idiosyncratic trends within the markets and the wide breadth of opportunities. This is Market Bites. I'm Libby Cherry, and for more content like this, follow us on your favorite platforms.
The President has been very clear that the United States, with our allies, is preparing a range of very severe economic measures to impose on Russia if it further invades Ukraine.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
I'm Mark Crumpton with First Word News. Russia has confirmed that its ground forces have moved into Ukraine, saying troops cleared from Crimea. They entered from Crimea, excuse me. A Russian lawmaker says the intent is to ensure a pro-Moscow government pushing out any U.S. influence. The government in Kyiv has declared martial law. After meeting with G7 leaders, President Biden tweeted that they have agreed to move forward on his words, devastating packages of sanctions and other economic measures. Russia's foreign minister said that Russia, quote, will always be ready for a dialogue with NATO on the very day the government launched that wide-ranging attack on Ukraine. But Sergei Lavrov reiterated Moscow's concern that Russia's demands to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and other security guarantees had been ignored.
We hope that the chance for return to the international law, international obligations is still there. And as we take the measures announced by the President to ensure the security of the country and the Russian people, we certainly would always be ready for a dialogue which will bring us back to justice and the principles of the United Nations Charter.
Russia's attack hit Ukrainian cities and bases with airstrikes or shelling, and civilians have piled into trains and cars to flee. Ukraine's government said Russian tanks and troops rolled across the border in what was described as a full-scale war that could rewrite the geopolitical order and whose fallout has already reverberated around the world. There's been a stock rout in Russia today following news of the Ukraine invasion. It's now the third worst plunge in market history in local currency terms. Investors are dumping the nation's assets as Moscow's military action is being condemned by Western leaders who have vowed to step up penalties on Russia. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
This is a special edition of Bloomberg Markets The Close, and as Mark Crumpton was just telling us here, we have 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. One of those people is Henry Meyer. He's in our Moscow bureau covering Bloomberg's Russian and politics, international affairs coverage for us here at Bloomberg. And Henry, want to come to you really to get a better sense of how people in Russia and how just folks in Russia are right now are reacting to the news of this invasion.
Well, we've seen some scattered protests across the country. Approximately 1,000 people were detained today in about 45 cities. Of course, I mean, there are a lot of people privately are absolutely aghast at what is happening. But, the level of repression that we've seen in the last few years, people are frightened to speak their minds. I think that the war, which is now taking place, is a huge shock for the Russian population.
And talk to us about that shock, because from many I'm hearing that perhaps understand how Putin's changed over the years. In the last couple of years, he's become increasingly isolated and perhaps less understood. It was a very swift turnaround and sort of lack of education to his populace, right? Is he understanding the way that his people think right now?
I'm afraid that he's got this mindset at the moment where he is determined to go for broke, to restore Russian control over Ukraine, and he's just doesn't take any account of public opinion. He believes that there will be a price to pay. It will be an economic price, but that's too bad, because this is something that is important in terms of history, and as you mentioned, his isolation, that's a very important part of it. The last 2 years during the pandemic, he has been very much isolated from the outside world, and I think this is one of the reasons why we are in the situation we're in today.
All right, Bloomberg's Henry Meyer in Moscow, thank you so much. And Henry was talking about the economic price that Russia may have to pay, but sanctions also could mean a price for global economies, not just in terms of growth, but also on the inflation front. And it raises a question of what this means for global central banks. We have started to see a pulling back in expectations for the number of hikes we could see out of the ECB, the BOE, and the Fed, which is what we're looking at here, but it hasn't pulled back that much. We are still expecting the Federal Reserve rate, for example, to be 148 basis points higher by the end of the year, even if we're seeing moves, bets on a 50 basis point move in March come down a little bit. So let's get more on this with Michael Shaul, Market Field Asset Management CEO. Michael, it's a difficult one for central banks when you have growth concern on the one hand, but potentially higher inflation on the other. How do you think it changes the calculus?
I don't think it's going to change it a great deal. I'm of the mind that the growth is actually pretty strong, and that inflation is going to be the number one issue for central banks to address, at the beginning of 2022. I think maybe there's some pressure on a central bank like the Federal Reserve to do 25 versus 50 basis points in March. But if what is happening in the Ukraine has a long-term impact on commodity supply, very definitely that would be inflation.
I'm interested, though, by the reaction function of the Fed, or indeed the ECB, because we're hearing from Robert Holtzman, who himself is actually a pretty hawkish official over at the ECB. He himself talking actually that maybe we're moving towards normalizing monetary policy, but the speed may now somewhat be delayed. Is that what the market's currently trying to digest? Are we putting off the 50 basis points hike in the US? Are we putting back the so-called September-October hike in Europe?
No, I would be very cautious of interpreting anything about a day, like this. I mean, clearly what's happening is it's a big macro shock. It's a big margin shock. Cross-asset trades are really all over the place on a day like this. So as I say, I wouldn't take market prices that seriously on a day like today. But look, I think that the central banks do have a political audience and do have a sort of broader social audience, and I'm sure the ECB remembers its terrible mistakes in the summer of 2008 and 2011, when it did hike. And the Fed remembers its mistake in 2018. And as I say, my assumption all along has been that the Fed would stick to a 25 basis point hike in March, because it has the option of additional hikes later on in 2022. And as I say, I think the Ukraine is a reasonable excuse to take that path.
It certainly provides a bit of cover here, Michael. I'm curious whether it also maybe induces a little bit more coordination amongst the central banks in a way that we weren't necessarily anticipating a few months ago.
Yeah, look, I think one thing I would not be surprised to see would be the rollout of FX swaps, particularly into Eastern Europe. That's a fairly easy thing for the ECB and all the Fed to do. It's been used before, very successfully in 2008. And that's a way of getting liquidity perhaps to the part of the world which is most directly affected and may need it the most. So I think that's the sort of coordination you may see. But, this is one of those times that central banks have found themselves way behind, economic progress. And as I say, it's very difficult to see central banks avoiding some sort of material tightening in 2022. I don't think they have much of a choice.
So, Michael, in this environment where central banks are tightening, when geopolitical risks are at the forefront, where is your best hedge? Where do you find safety?
I don't think there's much safety, but I think there's opportunity. We do think we're in the middle of a really powerful commodity bull market. I think that those are the sectors which are doing the best, and I think that the indexes with very high commodity weights, many of which are doing terribly today, are probably where you want to be over the rest of 2022.
We want to thank you so much, as always, with your expertise, your focus when you used to run Parker Square Associates as well over in Manhattan, but now Michael Schall as Market Field Asset Management CEO with some of the take there. And we are, of course, about to hear from President Biden himself. We await for comments, indeed, on the Russia into Ukraine attack and, indeed, the ramifications for them. Oil, we know, of course, has been surging at the current moment, up above $105 at one point, the highest in 8 years as we see Russia attack Ukraine. We're going to discuss the cross-asset implications of all of this. Ellen Wald's going to be with us, Atlantic Council Global Energy Center Senior Fellow, as we, of course, still await the President of the United States. This is Bloomberg.
Has introduced new curbs that seek to stem activities for the unvaccinated. Italy currently has one of the highest vaccination rates in Europe. About 90% of the population above 12 has received 2 doses of COVID-19 vaccine. But as the number of cases has been rising in recent weeks, Prime Minister Mario Draghi has been seeking to convince even the last people to get a COVID shot.
E non dobbiamo mai perdere di vista una constatazione, che gran parte dei problemi che abbiamo oggi dipende dal fatto che ci sono dei non vaccinati. Persone non vaccinate hanno una probabilità molto maggiore di sviluppare la malattia e forme gravi della malattia.
A proof of vaccination or a proof that the person recovered from COVID is called Super Green Pass. A Super Green Pass is required also to drink an espresso at the bar. I'm going for a coffee in Central Rome. This bar in Central Rome has introduced an automatic reader for the pass. People need to show the proof before accessing the bar. The government has also approved a mandatory vaccination for people aged above 50 years.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
And there you see it, a picture of the East Room of the White House, of course, the largest room in the White House. They're on the first floor waiting to hear from President Joe Biden about whatever the response is going to be to Russia's incursion into Ukraine. As we, of course, wait on the president to speak here, we are keeping our eyes here on the markets. We should point out it's been a relatively wild day here. The NASDAQ was actually down as much as 3%. It's actually higher now by about 0.6%, though. One group of stocks still in the red, though, are some of the Russian stocks. And I believe the president of the United States is now coming out. Let's take a listen in to what he has to say.
Good afternoon. The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack. Vladimir Putin has been planning this for months, as we've been saying all along. He moved more than 175,000 troops, military equipment and positions along the Ukrainian border. He moved blood supplies into position and built a field hospital, which tells you all you need to know about his intentions all along. He rejected every good faith effort the United States and our allies and partners made to address our mutual security concerns through dialogue to avoid needless conflict and avert human suffering. For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen. And now it's unfolding largely as we predicted. In the past week, we've seen shelling increase in the Donbass, the region in eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. The Russian government has perpetrated cyber attacks against Ukraine. We saw a staged political theater in Moscow, outlandish and baseless claims that Ukraine was about to invade and launch a war against Russia, that Ukraine was prepared to use chemical weapons, that Ukraine committed a genocide. Without any evidence, we saw a flagrant violation of international law in attempting to unilaterally create two new so-called republics on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And at the very moment that the United Nations Security Council was meeting to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty, to stave off invasion, Putin declared his war. Within moments, missile strikes began to fall on historic cities across Ukraine. Connection lost. Then came the air raids, followed by tanks and troops rolling in. We've been transparent with the world. We've shared declassified evidence about Russia's plans and cyber attacks and false pretexts so that there could be no confusion or cover-up about what Putin was doing. Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. And I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response. I just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning, and we're in full and total agreement. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose major, and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets.
We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself. Cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. This includes VTB, the second largest bank in Russia, which has $250 billion in assets. As promised, we're also adding the names to the list of Russian elites and their family members that were sanctioned as well. As I said on Tuesday, these are people who personally gain from the Kremlin's policies, and they should share in the pain. We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead. On Tuesday, we stopped the Russian government from raising money from U.S. or European investors. Now we're going to apply the same restrictions to Russia's largest state-owned enterprises, companies with assets that exceed $1.4 trillion. Some of the most powerful impacts of our actions will come over time as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It'll strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions. And we're preparing to do more. In addition to the economic penalties we're imposing, we're also taking steps to defend our NATO allies, particularly in the East. Tomorrow, NATO will convene a summit. We'll be there to bring together the leaders of 30 allied nations and close partners to affirm our solidarity and to map out the next steps we will take to further strengthen all aspects of our NATO alliance. Although we provided over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again. Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all. Over the past few weeks, I ordered thousands of additional forces to Germany and Poland as part of our commitment to NATO. On Tuesday, in response to Russia's aggressive action, including its troop presence in Belarus and the Black Sea, I've authorized the deployment of ground and air forces already stationed in Europe to NATO's eastern flank allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Our allies have also been stepping up, adding the other allies, the rest of NATO, adding their own forces and capabilities to ensure collective defense. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal, to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden our cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russian propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them. But the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence. They have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine. May God protect our troops. Associated Press, Zeke.
So do you have any plans to speak with President Putin at this point? And what interactions have you had with the Russian government?
I heard the first part. Do I have any plans to speak with Putin at this point, and what?
What communications have you had with the Kremlin as far as military operations in Ukraine and making sure this does not spiral into a larger conflict?
Well, it's a large conflict already. The way we're going to ensure it's not going to aspire to a larger conflict is by providing all the forces needed in the Eastern European nations that are members of NATO. NATO is more united than it's ever been, and I have no plans to talk with Putin.
Mr. President.
Wall Street Journal, Tarina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be a part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take. Cecilia Vega, ABC.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time, and we have to show resolve so he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur, he's going to say, oh my God, these sanctions are coming, I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Will he go beyond Ukraine, sir? Do you see him going beyond?
Yes.
Thank you. Two topics, just really quick. First, markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond, and markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely. As long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period. What's the next question? I'm sorry.
The next question is, did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did in the summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, he was, I made it clear, as an adversary, and I said he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's written. Did you read I shouldn't, I'm not being a wise guy. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour's worth of speeches, why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
And with that, with his ambitions, you're confident that these devastating sanctions are going to be as devastating as Russian missiles and bullets and tanks?
Yes, Russian bullets, missiles, and tanks in Ukraine. Yes, I am.
Thank you, President Biden. If sanctions cannot stop President Putin, what penalty can?
I didn't say sanctions couldn't stop him.
You've been talking about the threat of these sanctions for several weeks now.
Yes, but the threat of the sanctions and imposing the sanctions and seeing the effect of the sanctions are two different things. They're two different things. And we're now he's going to begin to see the effect of the sanctions.
And what will that do? How will that change his mindset here, given he's
because
attacking
it will so
Ukraine
weaken his country that he'll have to make a very, very difficult choice as to whether to continue to move toward being a second-rate power or, in fact, respond.
You said in recent weeks that big nations cannot bluff when it comes to something like this. You recently said that the idea of personally sanctioning President Putin was on the table. Is that a step that you're prepared to take? And if not,
It's not a bluff, it's on the table.
sanctioning President Putin?
Yes.
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President?
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President, if I can, you detailed some severe and swift new sanctions today and said the impact it will have over time. But given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Yes.
Can I ask you about Zelensky? Sir, you spoke to Vladimir Zelensky yesterday, sir.
What's the risk that we are watching the beginning of another Cold War, and is there now a complete rupture in U.S. and Russian relations?
There is a complete rupture right now in U.S.-Russian relations if they continue on this path that they're on. And in terms of a Cold War, that depends. You have the vast majority of the rest of the world in total opposition to what he's doing, from Asia to South America to Europe to around the world. And so it's going to be a cold day for Russia. The idea, you don't see a whole lot of people coming to his defense.
And are you, if I could follow up, sir, are you urging China to help isolate Russia? Are you urging China to help isolate Russia?
I'm not prepared to comment on that at the moment. Yeah. No. He's had his hand up a long time.
Thank you, Mr. President. How concerned are you that Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine into other countries, and the U.S. will have to get involved if he moves into NATO countries?
Well, if he did move into NATO countries, he will be involved. We will be involved. The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened. If we don't move against him now with these significant sanctions, he will be emboldened. And look, you know, well, anyway.
Can you talk anything more about your conversation? Mr. President.
Why not sanction Putin directly today?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sir, India, which is a major defense partner of the United States, is India fully with you on the issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Does the Defense Department of the United States?
Sir, India is one of your major defense partners. Is India fully in sync with the United States on Russia?
We're in consultation with India today. We haven't resolved that completely.
One more question.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
May I yield the financial impact, sir? Are you sanctioning President Putin?
All right, folks, of course,
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everyone. A very busy Thursday and a volatile market day as well. It is Thursday, February 24th, 2022. Tim Stenovic is off. Paul Sweeney, co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance and Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Radio, is joining me in studio. And we are live, of course, on YouTube and, of course, here in our Interactive Brokers studio. It's a tricky one.
It's a tricky one. I mean, we started the year 2022 seeing a lot of volatility in this market, spiking inflation, investors trying to get a handle on how this year will unfold economically. And then you add into that the geopolitical risk here that we're seeing in real time here today. It's something else for this market to digest. It's something else for a lot of these fund managers and analysts to kind of figure out, how do I put that risk into my equation?
Yeah, and exactly. And on a day when we're hearing from a lot of Fed speakers who are being like, listen, we're still on track. We got to do something at that March meeting, but we're keeping an eye on this.
That's right. And it's always the Fed, and that has been one of the key issues here. So it's good to get some color from them as well.
All right. Well, a warm welcome to all of our listeners and viewers on YouTube. Of course, as we said, there is one story for us, and that is the Russian invasion into Ukraine and the reaction in the financial markets. But it's also a personal story. We are going to cover it over the next 3 hours. With that in mind, let's set the Business Week agenda on this Thursday. And joining us to do that is Kriti Gupta, markets correspondent at Bloomberg, here in our Interactive Broker studio, as is Michael McKee, international economics and policy correspondent at Bloomberg News. Mike, I do want to start with you. I feel like you and I have been together here at Bloomberg for a long time.
Many invasions, yeah.
Yes. Many invasions, many stress points, 9/11, you think about it, and like, how do you put this into context?
Well, this is obviously one of the worst things that has happened since World War II. We don't yet know the spillover effects, but I would say the last time we saw anything like this was 9/11 and the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. At this point, because we don't know how long this is going to last, and because we don't know how Russia is going to react to the sanctions that are just being announced, it's hard to say what the long-term or even medium-term impact of it is, other than we're going to see higher inflation from higher energy prices. But right now we have to wait and see over the next 48 to 72 hours to see how this develops.
But it's not a game of chicken anymore, because things are happening.
No, it's real. This is real, and people have to react to it. And the problem, obviously, that we have, and certainly for investors, is we could find out something completely different in a little while, and that changes your calculations. So it's kind of best, and I was talking with Paul this morning. We were saying, you look at the drop in the markets, and it's probably less about people saying, I want to sell because I'm going to lose money on this or that company. It's like, I don't know what I want to buy. So I'm going to just raise some cash, and I'm going to sit there and figure out.
Yeah, it's interesting, Kriti. We had this. This is a market that's had a lot of volatility. I'm looking at the VIX right now, just south of 33. And so we had the news cross this morning, and when markets were opening, a lot of volatility in the equity markets. We've actually got NASDAQ up, but the S&P down. A lot of gyrations. I guess that should not be a surprise.
A lot of gyrations, but take a look at what they're actually buying. If you look at some of these stocks, I mean, you have things ranging from Yandex, which, by the way, I just discovered was a Russian company. Okay. Yandex, which is down like 50% or something. And then you kind of compare that to cybersecurity stocks, which are up 9-10% today. So those are kind of trades that you're making here, right? What stocks are going to be defensive? What stocks are going to give you less exposure to that region? And that's really what's kind of pushing the NASDAQ higher right now. What's also interesting is that technicals do play a role here. You did have the NASDAQ hit 20% and then kind of bounce back from that. The S&P 500 following the NASDAQ.
Is that the first time we know? Have we already officially seen the NASDAQ go down 20%, or that? No, this was a new technical low here.
I believe it has hit 20%. I will quickly double check that for you as we're discussing this. But I think to your point, Paul, the volatility is really the key piece of it, because as Mike said, no one knows what's happening. And I think the key headline here in the press conference that you actually just heard was that he has larger ambitions than Ukraine. And that's really, I think, the scary part, is that if the United States has to get even more involved beyond sanctions, that's another level of geopolitical risk that the market just hasn't accounted for.
I'm going to say what's scary is what came near the end of that press conference after President Biden spoke, where he was asked, are you urging China to isolate Russia? Not ready to comment on that yet. Mike, how do you factor that in? I mean, that's something that I'm watching very closely, the China reaction.
Oh, yeah, because that was going to be the big face-off for the Biden administration going forward. And the Chinese have long had this view that we should stay out of the internal workings of other countries, and here comes their ally Russia doing just the opposite. So what position do they take? Does this embolden them on Taiwan? I think that's a major step to take. We would have to see on that, but it does complicate things tremendously, because where's Russia going to turn if it can't trade? It's going to go to China. And so that's only going to bring them closer together. Now, the Chinese are ascendant, the Russians are descendant in terms of their economies. And so Putin would have to be careful there, but it does create a much bigger obstacle for sort of the, I don't want to use the word Washington consensus because that's out of favor, but sort of the Western view of how you should run economies.
But don't you wonder, Paul, too, like I think about President Xi kind of taking notes here, another authoritarian regime, you know, thinking, okay, what does this mean maybe for my intentions or plans on Taiwan?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of, I would say, folks are in Washington are saying, I can draw a line from our removal from Afghanistan to maybe Ukraine to maybe Taiwan, and you can tie all that together. Right. That's not a good narrative for anybody, certainly not the folks of Taiwan and Ukraine, but also for just, the global economy.
You know, and to bring the fact about China and Taiwan, let's take a look at the currency picture, because if you're actually looking at what currencies have performed well beyond the havens, well, during this entire geopolitical risk, the offshore yuan has actually strengthened quite a bit. We're looking at 6.3 when it comes to the rate that the dollar exchanges for a yuan, essentially. What's interesting here is if you actually look at Russian reserves, and this has been the big question, how much have they cushioned their economy? They've pulled out of the dollar for a lot of their debt, for a lot of their reserves, and they've actually done more trades, more exports in euros and yuan. So as we talk about more geopolitical
like they're
tensions,
almost been planning this.
so it kind of seems like it. But those are going to be the currencies you want to watch as opposed to just those havens. Mike,
I was just going to say, Mike, I mean, the Federal Reserve, we're hearing some commentary out of there today. Should they just wait and see?
No, that's what they're going to do.
I
mean, basically, that's all of the Fed speakers today say it's too early to know what's going to happen. The same with a lot of people at the ECB, except for a couple of the big hawks, Isabel Schnabel from Germany and Robert Holtzman from Austria, who were like, we should do 2-3 rate increases this year, and now saying we should go slow and see what happens, because they know they've got a big problem on their hands.
All right, I don't want to stop because you guys are amazing, but we got to. Kriti Gupta, Bloomberg Markets correspondent, and of course our Michael McKee, international economics and policy correspondent at Bloomberg News. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar, Paul Sweeney. We also do want to welcome our listeners on Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston. They are joining us as well. In the meantime, we've got to get a check on world and national news over to Nancy Lyons. She's in D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Carol. President Biden says the Russian attack on Ukraine was a premeditated attack, showing it was never about security, but about Russian President Vladimir Putin's naked aggression.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Biden says the U.S. will impose sanctions on Russia that will limit its ability to do business in foreign currencies and will also cut off 4 more financial institutions.
We've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself. Cut it off from the U.S. financial system.
Biden says Putin will soon become a global pariah. Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo is monitoring the situation from Brussels. She says Kyiv is Vladimir Putin's main target.
The focus here will be on the capital of Ukraine. Whenever there's an armed conflict, whenever it's a war, the capital city is always a big prize. This would be a huge propaganda win for Vladimir Putin to say we were there in 24 hours.
But Maria Tadeo says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is vowing to stay in the capital to face whatever is next. Residents in Kyiv are taking cover. Mariana says air raid sirens have been going off regularly since the fighting started.
Right now, I'm in a bomb shelter. It's probably the 4th or the 5th time we're getting here downstairs. We stay with our bags prepared, with our documents. Windows are always open because just we need to hear the sirens.
Mariana says there are traffic jams throughout the capital and long lines for everything. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now let's check in with Charlie Pellet for a business flash.
Hi, thank you very much, Nancy Lyons. Fast-moving markets, right to the numbers. Stocks trading mixed. S&P down 19 right now, a drop of 0.5%. The Dow down 456, a drop of 1.5%. Nasdaq up. Best level of the day right now, up 120, a gain of 0.9%. 10-year up 13.30 seconds, 10-year yield 1.94%. Stocks have pared back losses from the depths of a sell-off as President Biden announces additional sanctions on Russian banks and says the U.S. will release more strategic oil as conditions warrant. Crude oil surging today. West Texas Intermediate now up 1.2%, 93.22 a barrel. Brent trading back below $100 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, had been trading above 105 earlier today. Right now, barrel of Brent up 2.74%, up $2.65 a barrel. Gold on the minus side now, down 0.3%, down $6 the ounce at $19.02. Again, the 10-year 1.94%. So again, recapping, U.S. equities are trading mixed. Right now, we have got the S&P down 22, down 0.5. Nasdaq up 120. We have got the Dow down 504. Lots of earnings again after the closing bell today. Among some of the names that we'll be hearing from: Dell, VMware, Etsy, Intuit, Autodesk, and Coinbase Global. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Oh, yeah, there's still earnings going on. You got to remember that, right, Paul?
There still is, exactly.
All right, a lot going on, but as Charlie broke down the trade, we're definitely off our worst levels when it comes to the equity trade. All right, we know there's a lot going on. We are all focused on Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has seen military forces go in from the north, east, and south, accompanied by missile and artillery fire. So let's get some thoughts on both the economic and geopolitical implications of that invasion. Peter Cheer, head of macro strategy at Academy Securities, along with retired Major General Maston Robeson. He is geopolitical intelligence advisor to the Academy's advisory board, and he served over 34 years of active duty in the U.S. Marine Corps in more than 60 countries. Peter, from Florida, General Robeson, he is with us on the phone from South Carolina. First and foremost, let's not forget, we are watching financial markets. We are watching and trying to figure out the political strategy, watching these press conferences. But as people keep reminding me on Twitter, there are people's lives at stake and a lot of uncertainty. So I just wanted to put that out there because we do need to keep that front and center. General, let me start with you, though. You've spent more than 3 decades facing global situations and stresses. What are the extreme risks here, and how likely is that to play out in your view?
Yeah, the extreme risks are obviously significant. A lot will depend, I believe, on the world public opinion as to whether that will have an influence on what Putin does. If he receives it, there's sort of a agnostic approach to Ukraine and what he's doing there. I mean, you'd hate to think it, but certainly the Baltic states could be at stake as well. It'd be interesting to see what Finland does if this pushes them to reevaluate their association with NATO in an official capacity. But I agree with some of the decisions being made that I think there's some merit in looking at what we did in Kosovo back in the late 90s, where we really did harshly target not just the national leadership, but the oligarch level that were the business leaders and the finance leaders. So I think what I see U.S. and United Kingdom and others doing of freezing assets and seizing assets, or at least threatening to, will have as much or more of a powerful influence as, using military force to counter. I don't see the United States putting ground forces on the ground, but we'll certainly support with intelligence, with command and control, with air. NATO is certainly not committed to committing ground forces for Ukraine, but they have certainly a historical association to say we want to defend the concept of a democratic process that they've seen going on in Ukraine over the last decades.
And General, just to follow up, Bloomberg is reporting that Western allies see Kyiv falling to Russian forces within hours. Does that surprise you, that it's that swift?
Well, it doesn't surprise me it's that swift if that's what Putin wants to do. He could easily do that. My concern is if Kyiv falls, there will certainly high likelihood of a fairly significant refugee problem flowing out of Ukraine into Europe. That will change the metric on Europe. Historically, when you look at the Balkans, when you look at Kosovo in that area, it was one thing to go in and say we need to stop ethnic cleansing, but it changed the whole metric when you started having 1, 2, 3 million people refugeeing into Europe and the financial burden that put on the EU and on NATO. And that will certainly change the metric as to whether it's a threat to NATO economically, even if it's not a threat to NATO militarily.
All right, well, story just crossing the Bloomberg just about 20 minutes ago. Companies postponing bond sales in the U.S. and Europe, and credit risk gauges surging after Russia invaded Ukraine. Peter Cheer, I got to go to you on that. You're watching, you're head of macro strategy at Academy, watching the markets here. We have bounced back from kind of the more severe risk-off trade earlier in the day. How do you see it, and what in particular disturbs you when you watch the financial markets?
So clearly we've had a lot of excess risk in the system. We haven't gone away from having to deal with the Fed, and the Fed's fighting inflation. There's certainly no easing in the inflation pressure from this. So I think although this is impacting markets, we had that battle with the Fed. That's ongoing. We were at high valuations. I've become a little bit constructive this morning, actually yesterday. Obviously this overnight was a little bit scary, but kind of added more risk. And really the view there is that if this can become contained, if these sanctions are effective, slows them down, people kind of calm down and say, okay, Ukraine and Russia, this is awful for the people, particularly in Ukraine, but it is only a small part of the global economy. We will figure ways out around that. So I think that's why we're getting some of this bounce, is people are starting to try and say, if this is contained. So I'm comfortable with that for the near term. I'm a little bit concerned, one, that Putin won't be contained, that he sounded so aggressive Monday and again last night in his speeches that he is going to push the envelope. And the other thing is we have not discussed really what's China thinking about this? What does China do? Does China threaten anything? So I think there's a lot more things going forward that could go wrong than good. So although it's constructive, I'm pulling back a little bit. And the other area, though, I am very constructive on, the U.S. energy industry. I think this has to change for everyone going forward, how we think about energy, where we get our energy from, both in Western Europe and the U.S.
I felt like we had gotten there, Paul, for a while, right?
Yep, shale. Shale was all the rage. Went from being a net importer to a net exporter. But again, it just highlights the risk, particularly in Europe, on Russia. Peter, one of the issues here that I've seen analyzed today and discussed today is inflation. It's obviously one of the big headwinds for financial markets, even before today. But when you think about some of the sanctions, you think about where energy prices can go in the near to intermediate term, does this raise the inflation risk profile for you in these markets?
Sure. I think we're going to see some commodity inflation. We're also probably going to see some supply chains, right? If we start not seeing the flow of goods or commodities from Russia, that could screw up people's supply chains. So I do think this is going to be a little bit more inflationary. However, because it's going to be so clearly identified as this, I think it will give the administration breathing room maybe to help people out in some way, whether they can reduce gas taxes, whether we reinstate some of those child tax credits. Something to mitigate it is much easier now that it's so clearly defined. This next boost would really come from Russia. So I think, and the Fed will also be able to put on hold, because this will be viewed as temporary.
Wait, when you say Fed on hold, that means nothing March, or just?
I think the 50 bips in March is certainly off the table right now. I think they're going to be very careful about what they do when you have this period of volatility. And it's almost regardless of what market you're looking at, they are behaving very, very illiquidly, right? And we know during the pandemic, one of the things that scared the Fed was how illiquid the Treasury market had become, so they intervened. We're not at that stage yet, but you just look at these gaps, these air pockets where stock prices or bond prices are one level, and then you look 2 seconds later, they're at another level. So I think people are going to be very cautious about hiking, squeezing down liquidity when you're seeing the market really struggling to digest all this.
General, Russia, 150, maybe 200,000 troops, Ukraine, over 40 million people. What does Putin do after the government falls? Is it you can't occupy with that kind of force, can you?
No, you can't, and that is obviously the big question, is what is his really long-term intent? Is it purely and simply to own the eastern part of Ukraine so he overreaches?
right, let's get another check on that trading day and your top business stories on what's been a volatile day. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much indeed. Mixed markets right now, as you mentioned, the Dow, the S&P, they are both lower. S&P little change. NASDAQ is pushing higher. Do want to begin, though, with a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. The Securities and Exchange Commission is probing Elon Musk and his brother over Tesla stock sales. This according to Dow Jones. Tesla shares, they do remain higher. They initially fell on that word, but up now by 1%. Again, repeating that headline. SEC probing Elon Musk and his brother over Tesla stock sales. Again, this according to Dow Jones. President Biden says the United States will impose sanctions on Russia that will limit its ability to do business in foreign currencies as President Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine sparks the worst security crisis in Europe since World War II. The S&P 500 index lower by a point, little change right now. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 348, down 1.1%. At one point, the Dow was down 859. NASDAQ, best level of the day right now, reversing a 450-point drop, up now for NASDAQ by 182 points. NASDAQ higher by 1.4%. 10 years up 10/30 seconds, 10-year yield 1.95%. Spot gold down 0.9%, 18.90 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is up 0.3%, 92.35 a barrel. We've seen big moves in crude today. Brent, for example, was trading above $105, still positive on the day, up 1.6%, 98.39 right now on Brent. As for market implications with the Russian invasion, Christian Nolting is Chief Investment Officer for Wealth Management at Deutsche Bank Private Bank.
I think where the most important adjustment needs to take place is, first of all, in the energy prices. So what will be the action functions from sanctions? And what will be the action function from Russia on sanctions as well? So, and that has then consequences on inflation, and that has also consequences on growth. And regionally, that means, no surprise, that's more towards Europe than towards the US or Asia.
And Christian Nolting of Deutsche Bank was talking about energy. Energy stocks are lower today among the big oil stocks. ExxonMobil, for example, down now by 3.4%. BP plunging by 8.1%. Chevron down 2.6%. EOG Resources lower by 3.2%. And Pioneer Natural Resources down by 2.3%. Recapping, 10-year yield 1.95%. NASDAQ up 187 points. Best level of the day right now, up by 1.5%. As I speak, S&P 500 index just turning positive, up by 1 point right now, wiping out a 110-point loss. The Dow down 326, down 1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. We appreciate that. When I woke up to this news today, Carol, I said, this is so 20th century to me.
It does feel that way.
Aren't we past,
Invasions?
Russia invading an Eastern European country? It just seems so, again, 1960s, 1970s, but here we are. And as I was thinking about that, I came across an awesome article on the Bloomberg Terminal, how Ronald Reagan would have handled Putin's aggression. Tyler Cowen, he joins us. He is the reporter on this. Tyler Cowen, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and a professor of economics at George Mason University, joining us on the phone from lovely Fairfax, Virginia. Tyler, again, I love this column because it went right to the thought process I had is like, who does this stuff anymore? How do you think Reagan, or how do you think Russia views us? How do you think Reagan maybe would have dealt with a character like Vladimir Putin?
Russia views us as internally divided, more concerned with attacking and criticizing each other than standing up to tyranny in the world. They sense we are weak and that this is their moment to strike. And I think what Reagan understood very well is that America needed to be relatively unified. Doesn't mean we agree on everything, and realize the true threat is actually an external one, and that there are some governments that simply are evil and will do evil things, and we need to stand up to them.
That's the point I loved, is that I think of President Ronald Reagan in his cowboy hat and his cowboy boots, right? And this whole idea of there are good guys and bad guys. Do we need kind of a rethink when it comes to our, political observations in this world right now?
We very much need that rethink. If you look at a lot of the Republicans, they're saying, well, Putin, he's okay, or Trump is even saying Putin is this genius. You go back to 2012 when Obama debated Mitt Romney. Romney said Russia's a real threat. Obama mocked him, said that's like some old, out-of-date Cold War mentality. You can even see it on the tape on YouTube.
Well, and if I can just, so China, good guy, bad guy, right. Like, because that folds into this, Tyler.
Well, I think the key thing to do with China or with Russia is that in advance to have very strong alliances to advance American interests and democratic governments and ideas of liberty, and not wait until the last moment when you need to improvise something. So Ukraine, I think the last few weeks, Biden actually, he's done a perfectly good job. But there's been really decades of just letting the issue run on and not treating it as a priority. And it's going to be hard for American interests to be represented in what finally happens.
Do you think Washington gets this, Tyler? I mean, if I'm a Russian intelligence agent, I don't have to be very good. All I have to do is turn on the television news over the last 6 years, and I see Americans all around the country literally fighting with each other, physically fighting with each other for the last 6 or 7 years, and we rarely saw that before. Do you think Washington gets that?
I think people are starting to get it, and I hope that what's happening in Ukraine, for all of its tragic sides, will be a wake-up call and have some positive effects on this country. But look, this is day 2 of the actual fighting. We don't know yet. There's a risk it will disappear from the headlines, and America will go back to how it was. And I wrote the column hoping to show people, no, we need to recapture this older vision. Freedom really matters. Some countries believe in freedom, other countries don't. That's a fundamental division. And to make that the centerpiece of our attention.
And abroad, NATO, I guess people were questioning the solidarity of NATO, but up to this point, it seems like President Biden and the other leaders of the West have projected a pretty strong and united NATO. Is that kind of how you're reading it?
Well, there's a lot of different moving pieces here. I would say overall the sanctions appear to be weak so far.
Yep.
I don't blame that on NATO. But when Biden gives a talk, the Russian stock market goes up. I don't know. I don't blame the people in the moment. They're playing a bad hand in terms of the cards. But it does seem to show we're not very well positioned to have an effective response.
So there's even been division, obviously, in the Republican Party about the response to this. I mean, there's division, so much political division here, right? So how do they come together? Will politicians kind of figure their way past through the things that they don't agree on to kind of figure out what we need to do to fight those evil empires that are out there? And just got about 40 seconds.
Republicans need to decide that the sympathetic to Putin factions in their midst don't really have a place in the party. I hope that will happen. A prediction, I don't know.
Well, interesting, right? And another layer to all of this in terms of how we deal with this domestically. Tyler, really thoughtful column. So appreciate it. Tyler Cowen, he is columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, professor of economics at George Mason University, joining us on the phone from Fairfax, Virginia. But I do think about this, right? This is a time, we needed it during COVID, right? We need it now in terms of unity.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think the rest of the world sees what we see and sees what is actually happening in our country. And maybe this is a repercussion of that.
I'm thinking about the State of the Union. Like, are we going to be dealing with this, and how much, ultimately we'll have to play, or will it be something we can look and start to put behind us? Fingers crossed. All right, let's get back to World and National News. We've been covering it all hour. Here's Nancy Lyons in D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Carol. That's the sound of war descending on Ukraine. Citizens of the country are being told to take up arms. Russian military vehicles are already in the northern region that includes the capital of Kyiv, and Russian President Vladimir Putin has made it clear his goal is to take over the government. The U.S. is responding by announcing new sanctions against Russia that President Biden vows will inflict a severe cost on the Russian economy. They include sanctions on 4 more Russian banks that represent an estimated $1 trillion in assets, and limiting the ability of the Kremlin to raise money from U.S. and European investors. Biden says he's working to do what he can to prevent Americans from feeling the pain caused by reduced Russian oil supplies.
I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me.
Biden says Putin's actions, though, cannot go unanswered. Global affairs analyst Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group calls this the start of another Cold War and tells Bloomberg Vladimir Putin was never honest about his intentions.
You don't deploy that kind of force and risk not just tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives, which will be lost, but also Russian soldiers. You don't do that unless you intend to overthrow this government.
Ian Bremmer with Eurasia Group, a Western intelligence official, says it's likely that Kyiv may fall to Russian forces by tonight. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. Nancy Lyons with the World and National News update there in our D.C. Bureau. Just a reminder, folks, we are pretty much at our best levels of the session when it comes to the equity trade. So we're up 1.8% on the NASDAQ, S&P just a hair higher, Dow still down about 1%, but definitely off our lows of the session. Meanwhile, one of the things that came up in when President Biden made those comments about more U.S. reaction to that Russian invasion, he also took some questions, and one of the questions was about China. It sounds like he's not talking too much about that yet. And we also haven't heard much talk from China about this Russian invasion.
I tell you, one of the great things about being back in the office, which is a truism, is that you literally run into people who you can get ideas from. And today, Andy Brown, who runs our new economy business, he's our expert in Bloomberg on all things China. I literally grabbed him in the hallway and asked him for his thoughts. And he says China is paying very close attention here. He doesn't think China told Russia, don't do this, you shouldn't do this, he says they're just watching and see how everybody reacts, see how the U.S. reacts, see how the NATO reacts, see how the central bankers react, because they've got some chips on the table, too, as it relates to other parts of the world, namely Taiwan.
You're like me. Andy Brown, we usually have him on every week. He's been out doing some Olympic coverage for NBC.
And growing a beard.
And growing a beard. I had to take a double take when I saw him up on TV. Same thing. I started jotting notes. He talks about China tethering itself to Russia. We know that China's benefited from economic globalization. China is Ukraine's largest trading partner, but China believes democracy is also on its last legs and wants to push back on democracy. We heard, I think, Peter Cheer also talking about this whole idea of, crushing the dollar.
Yep.
We know China's been on a mission to this. Andy also saying earlier on Bloomberg TV, China wants to rewrite the global rules. We know that, Paul.
Yes, we do. And they're ascendant. And we just spent 2 weeks in China with watching the Olympics, and we saw how tightly controlled that was and how they're dealing with the pandemic. So a fascinating angle here as we keep our attention on Eastern Europe.
And China's still refusing to condemn that Russian attack, so we're waiting to hear that. And we'll see if it happens. This is Bloomberg Radio.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got the S&P, NASDAQ, both trading higher. The Dow remains on the minus side. 10-year yield right now, 1.95%. Stocks paring back losses from the depths of a sell-off as President Biden announces additional sanctions on Russian banks and says the U.S. will release more strategic oil as conditions warrant. Crude been on a wild ride today. At one point we had Brent, that's the international benchmark, trading above $105 a barrel. Barrel of Brent still higher at $98.92. Brent crude up by 2.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 77 cents a barrel, $92.86 right now on WTI, higher now by 0.9%. Spot gold retreating now by 1.1%, down 20 points, $18.88 the ounce. And again, the 10-year up 11.30 seconds. 10-year yield right now 1.95%. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ trading mixed with the S&P up 11 right now, higher by 0.3%. And worth putting today's movements in perspective because at one point we had the S&P down 110. Again, the S&P up now by 0.4. The Dow at one point down 859, down 2.6%. Again, the Dow lower now by 238, down 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I know the swings alone are just wild. Yes. I've just been looking at, right, from peak to, from high to low, basically. Hey, listen, one other story that's certainly been on our radar is today's Bloomberg Big Take, and it covers how President Biden's inner circle feared sanctions to scare off President Putin, that they wouldn't ultimately work. And that story from Bloomberg News foreign policy reporter Nick Wadhams, you can find it on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com. But Nick, luckily for us, joins us on the phone from Washington, D.C. So, Nick, what were you hearing about President Biden's inner circle when it came to sanctions?
Well, today and the president's recent press conference he just had now has kind of thrown everything up in the air. But essentially what I was hearing over the last few weeks, and the story I wrote that came out this morning, was that the administration had been pushing a strategy telegraphing that, they wanted to tell Vladimir Putin how bad the sanctions against him would be as a way of deterring him from going to war. Of course, then the president just gave a press conference just now saying no one had ever believed that. That's what I was hearing from a lot of folks, that they never really believed the strategy. And that's important because the administration is just sort of fundamentally rewriting the way that sanctions are used. They wanted to test this proposition that, okay, we're not willing to put military boots on the ground in Ukraine. What we're going to do instead is telegraph the severe economic sanctions that you'll face if you invade. Obviously, President Vladimir Putin just ignored that. He's gone ahead and showed that that threat didn't deter him after all.
Yeah, Nick, that's kind of where I wanted to go, because I'm just looking at your story here, and you reported that late last year, President Biden, made it clear that the U.S. would not send troops or heavy weapons to Ukraine. In hindsight, was that admission, was that strategic communication a mistake?
Well, they argue it was not a mistake because they felt that the primary purpose of that in a lot of ways was to make sure that Vladimir Putin had no excuse, that the world was very clear about what exactly he was doing and how his arguments had no basis in fact. And they really wanted to project an air of unity, allied nations arrayed against Vladimir Putin, and to isolate him. So the messaging campaign toward Russia for a long time has been about not just cornering Vladimir Putin, but making a bigger point, sending a signal that allies were united, and also sending a signal to other countries like China, if it has designs on Taiwan, we're not going to let you get away with it. The problem there, of course, is that if Vladimir Putin is able to get away with it, if these sanctions are not as impactful as the U.S. claims they are, well, then Xi Jinping may get the opposite message and realize that he can do it without maximum punishment from the West.
So, Nick, reading the tea leaves today, I'm sure you're talking to your sources in Washington. You got to tell me, or I hope you can tell me, there's some bipartisan support for condemning what Russia is doing. Do you have that sense that Republicans and Democrats view this for what it is, which is an invasion of essentially an inferior country in terms of military clout?
Yeah, I mean, we are well past the days when you would see an action like this trigger a response where there would be, bipartisan statements where you would have senators and members of the House from both sides of the aisle issuing joint statements saying that, a foreign policy issues like this stops at the water's edge. We're united in confronting Putin. But, I mean, generally speaking, they are actually pretty unified in their approach to this. Both sides are now calling for the same thing. They want really intense sanctions. They want Biden to keep going. They want more help for Ukraine, and they're pretty strident and similar in their condemnations of Russia. Of course, Republicans, in large part, also blame Joe Biden for this. They say that Putin took advantage and got a signal from what happened in Afghanistan, and he pounced on it. Democrats aren't making that claim, but there is general unity on condemning Russia for the invasion itself.
What's interesting, too, and I wonder, there are sanctions that maybe, Russia can kind of shake off, but there's been a lot of talk about the international payment system and the international, how we are all connected financially and maybe blocking Russia from SWIFT. And so I do wonder, how does the inner circle feel about something like that?
I think they have always been very, very reluctant to use SWIFT for a couple of reasons. One, because you can achieve a lot of the goals of, if you sort of issue a blanket ban on Russia being able to do financial transactions, that's like dropping a nuclear bomb. Whereas if you go sanction individual banks, well, then you can achieve the same effect with those banks. But if you say, no, Russia can't conduct any financial transactions through SWIFT, that then makes it impossible to do any of the sort of legitimate activity that is allowed that's not affected by sanctions. So the economic consequences to the West would be extremely severe. And they've always been very wary of doing SWIFT, though the administration says it's not ruling it out in the future if Vladimir Putin goes even further.
Hey, Nick, one of the interesting articles I read on the Bloomberg today was just kind of some reporting about maybe a little silver lining here for this whole issue here with Ukraine is the U.S. intel was spot on. And as opposed to, say, back in 2003 with the mass destruction and all those weapons of mass destruction, is there a feeling in D.C. that our intel really did get it right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see a fair number of victory laps by the intelligence community. But, what I've heard from folks, too, is that the intelligence in this case was pretty unambiguous. So obviously there's a lot they're not telling us about the degree of certainty.
Right.
They had the suggestion that there's some signals communication, but those satellite photos, I mean, man, those were pretty self-explanatory when you had Russia massing all those forces on the border.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick. We appreciate it. Bloomberg News foreign policy reporter Nick Wadhams joining us on the phone from Washington, D.C.
All right. February is Black History Month, and every day this month we are celebrating significant moments in U.S. Black history. Now with your installment for February 24th, here is Bloomberg's Renita Young.
On this day in Black history in 1864, Rebecca Lee Crumpler becomes the first Black woman to receive an MD degree. To put that into perspective, in 1860, there were only 300 women out of 54,543 physicians in the United States. None of them were African American. Crumpler first worked as a nurse in Charlestown, Massachusetts, before she was accepted into the New England Female Medical College. It was during a time when male physicians claimed women did not have the physical strength to practice medicine. In 1883, Crumpler released Book of Medical Discourses, which was one of the first medical books written by an African American. That's today in Black history. I'm Renita Young, Bloomberg Radio.
And that, of course, is Bloomberg's Renita Young. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Paul and I are going to join our TV colleagues for a look at the markets on this volatile day. This is Bloomberg.
close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is Countdown to the Close. Just 60 minutes left in the trading session. Caroline Hyde, Romain Bostic, Kaylee Lines, joined now by our colleagues Carol Massa, Paul Sweeney, as we have once again more special coverage at Bloomberg across TV, radio and YouTube, as the inevitable for many seems to have occurred with Russia indeed intruding upon Ukraine, Carol, and the ramifications are swift but extraordinary bounce back in terms of stocks.
Yeah, that bounce back is what I find, and the range from high to low. We've had about a 3% swing on the S&P 500 and about 5.5% or 700 points on the NASDAQ 100. You know, Paul, I'm thinking about how you started your day, and very different, right, from where we are today.
Very different. I'm just take a look at Brent crude here. We were over $105 a barrel, and now we're back down at $99 a barrel. So really a tremendous amount of volatility in crude oil.
Volatility in the NASDAQ, for me, front and center. We're currently looking at the benchmarks for our radio audience. I see the NASDAQ currently up 1.9%. Remember, this was a benchmark that was off about 3%. We were worried about growth stocks. We were worried about inflation. And now we see maybe a search for safety, or indeed the sanctions coming from President Biden not being as tough as some had expected. Dow Jones, the only key benchmark in the red, still off by 0.6%. That's 220 points to the downside. The S&P 500 now up 15 points. That's 0.3% higher. Russell 2000 also in the green to the tune of 1.25%, Kaylee.
Well, I think it's the NASDAQ and the NASDAQ 100 as well that really are remarkable here, because at the start of the day, we were talking about the precipice of a bear market, and now it is actually tech that is outperforming. And that is true, too, at the sector level. When you look beneath the surface of the S&P 500, your best performers on the day, communication services and information technology, they're each higher by the better part of 2%. What's on the bottom is a lot more of your cyclicals, energy and financials. Energy, of course, the outperformer on the year, but a laggard on the day as we saw oil prices rolling over. And then consumer staples, which of course is very sensitive to inflation, also is down pretty hard on the day. It's down by about 2.5 percentage points, Carol.
Let's have a quick look across asset, Romain, because I think also the oil reversal has been significant. The fact that it is still high, but not to the tune of much. We're above more than $100 a barrel. But this is a great chart, GMM, Global Macro Movers. You saw Europe fall hard. You saw the dollar still higher against everything. Yen rallies, dollar rises, euro goes lower. We see money fly into the safety of sovereign bonds. Commodities is an interesting one.
And we should point out, too, I mean, and commodities is an interesting one. I do want to comment, though, on the sovereign bonds, because we talk about this reversal that we've seen in the equity market here. That completely hasn't been unwound in the debt space and in some of those havens. You're still seeing that bid come into the dollar. In fact, the dollar is still having the best day against pretty much all of the world, not only the developed currencies, but the EM currencies, going back to the March 2020 sell-off here, even beating out the Swissy, even beating out the yen here. That flight that we saw into treasuries, well, that's still sticking. You go overseas and you look at the sell-off that you're seeing in Ukrainian bonds, Russian bonds, that's still there. The rise in CDS here. So while there is certainly a buy the dip moment here in the U.S., I don't think everyone is quite on board with the idea that, I guess, the all clear has been given.
Well, and that's a really good point, certainly on the corporate debt markets, right? We've seen companies both in the U.S. and Europe canceling bond sales, so that is definitely playing out. So there is still nervousness in the markets. You know, the big question is at this point, we need to be thinking about what is the Fed thinking about, and whether or not what's happening, unfortunate certainly for the people of Ukraine, but what does it do to the U.S. economy? How does it change their trajectory? There have been a bunch of Fed speakers out there, and we just wanted to mention some of them because it really plays into how we think about where we go from here, certainly in the U.S. market. Loretta Mester of the Cleveland Fed president, she came out and said, barring an unexpected turn in the economy, I believe it will be appropriate to move the funds rate up in March and follow with further increases in the coming months. She also went on to say the implications of the unfolding situation in Ukraine for the medium-run economic outlook in the U.S. will also be a consideration in determining the appropriate pace at which to remove accommodation. Raphael Bostic over at the Atlanta Fed saying if the numbers come in close to that, I think that we can continue with our liftoff plan. We will just have to see where things go, right? So just kind of hedging it a little bit, guys. Yeah. So what?
I feel like it's convenient. It gives them cover. And look, I mean,
no, isn't it truth? Isn't it reality? Like if this gets if we resolve this in a week, then things change in terms of the outlook. You already see it. People are coming back into the market saying, well, wait a minute. We've talked about it. Romain, you've brought it up in terms of military conflict.
I have.
These things tend not to last longer term.
Absolutely. And we heard from the President of the United States, it does not appear that at least the Western nations are ready for any sort of real military confrontation here. Maybe this is a ceding of the Ukraine, and as horrible as that is from a humanitarian perspective, yes, the economic ramifications, at least here in the United States, probably won't be as severe, and maybe that gives the Fed Fed the ability to continue forward apace with what we think they're going to do.
And I think what we all have been noting is the whipsawing in the market on the back of that statement coming from President Biden earlier at about 1:30 p.m. that sort of upended the views that maybe they'd take a really hard line. We're going to go to the White House now. Bloomberg Chief Washington correspondent Anne-Marie Horden joins us. And look, the markets have decided that the president didn't go as harsh as they thought he would.
Yeah, and there's two really big things probably for that, and that Russia was spared this afternoon, their evening, which is one, they're still going to be allowed to transact in the SWIFT payment system, the Gmail of transactions, millions of transactions a day. This is something that crippled Iran's economy in 2012. Second, of course, is that for the most part, as far as I'm seeing, and we're going to get a briefing with Jen Psaki, the press secretary, alongside one of the president's chief deputy national security advisors when it comes to international finance, I see that Russian oil and gas, for the most part, comes out unscathed. This is the lifeblood of the Russian economy that pays for the military. This is how President Putin has stored up his billions of dollars. This is at the heart of the matter. But again, the president made clear he's going to do everything he can to protect American consumers at the pump. So for a while, that says to me that Russian oil and gas is off the table.
Yeah, that's really certainly, I think, what American consumers are thinking about. Anne-Marie, what did you make of when President Biden was asked about China? Are you urging China to isolate Russia? He said he's not ready to comment. In the meantime, we did have a headline cross that the Chinese embassy in Ukraine preparing flights to evacuate citizens. How do we need to kind of strategize and think about China as an element here?
Well, I think last night China made clear they're not going to come out swiftly against Russia or backing Ukraine, but they were one of the only one last night at the UN Security Council meeting to not have a serious condemnation against Russia regarding what we saw of that invasion. This is a very thin line, tight line for Xi Jinping to straddle. Of course, while he sees sanctions that are pretty significant being placed on Russia due to their invasion of Ukraine, this potentially may be what he is watching if he was ever to make a play for Taiwan. Also, I've said this a few times today, and I think it is pretty important. Xi Jinping doesn't want to be preoccupied with this right now. He is about to have an enormous Communist Party meeting, and that's what he wants to focus on.
All right, great point, and you have just been rock solid, and I'm not sure if you're getting any sleep, but man, your coverage has been killer. Anne-Marie Horden there at the White House. Folks, we're going to be back in less than an hour's time. We'll count you down to the close with our cross-platform coverage Beyond the Bell on radio, TV, and YouTube. We'll be back counting you down to the close at 4 p.m. Wall Street time.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
So crazy that if you think about how we started the day, and
Yes.
I really thought, I was watching futures, I'm sure you were, like kind of overnight, late, into the early hours, and here we are.
And here we are, led by the tech stocks, NASDAQ up 2.3%. It's just been extraordinary. I think it just takes time for people to digest what's going on. As Anne-Marie was just reporting there, maybe the market's sensing, boy, these sanctions could have been a lot worse for the global economy. And so maybe the fact that the president didn't go there, at least initially, taken as a little bit of a good sign here by the markets.
Right. We talked earlier about like playing chicken. We know it's no longer that, right? Things are happening. Certainly Russia with the invasion and China, the United States and its NATO allies taking steps. But you do feel like they continue to take steps, right, Paul, rather than kind of a very severe smackdown.
Yeah, and I think the signaling here, the communication here by the White House has been very clear, very concise, and it's kind of playing out as we thought it might. And then again, that is something that markets probably appreciate. Don't like uncertainty. We've heard that a million times. That term as it relates to the markets, but there is a lot of truth in that. And I think this administration's done a pretty good job of trying to again signal and communicate how they're going to respond here. So at least it's done in the sense that
right.
The invasion has occurred. Now we can start thinking about outcomes.
The UBS Global Wealth Management Chief Investment Officer earlier put out some research and said Russia has a strong economic interest in continuing to sell its energy and other commodity exports to Europe. And so he thinks that this will weigh against a long-lasting military engagement. You just do wonder, right, how important it is to Putin.
Absolutely.
That he's still involved in this. All right, back to world and national news. On it, Nancy Lyons in D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Carol. President Biden calls Russia's assault on Ukraine an unprovoked, premeditated attack on the people of Ukraine.
For weeks, For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen. And now, it's unfolding largely as we predicted.
Biden unveiled another round of sweeping economic sanctions against Russia. They target Russian banks, oligarchs, state-controlled companies, and high-tech sectors, with Biden adding they were designed not to disrupt global energy markets.
We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies.
Biden says this is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, and the next few weeks will be especially hard on the people of Ukraine. The Russian military has already effectively eliminated Ukraine's air defenses and rapidly advanced toward the capital of Kyiv. Russian President Vladimir Putin gave his own address earlier today, justifying the attack, saying it was a matter of security for the breakaway republics. He says it was the West that created the fundamental threats that prompted his actions. He speaks here through an interpreter.
Circumstances require firm and immediate actions from us. Donbass's People's Republic asked for help from Russia. I decided to conduct a special military operation.
Putin ended his speech saying anyone who tries to get in their way should know that Russia's answer will be immediate, and it will lead to consequences of the sort we've never faced in our history. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. Nancy Lyons in our D.C. bureau and our 99.1 studio in Washington, D.C. So, we talk about the legitimization of cryptocurrencies. Yep. Well, it may be getting a big kind of leg up because of the crisis here.
Yeah, so a lot of folks are saying there's a good article on the Bloomberg today, crypto is potential new tool for billionaires to avoid sanctions. And I said, was my aha moment. It's like, oh, that actually is, I get it. It's supposedly anonymous accounts, and you put your money in crypto, Bitcoin, and Ethereum, and whatever else you're buying there, and that might be a way to shield some assets. Because I've been saying today, if you want to push these oligarchs and really press them, take back, repossess their flats in the West End of London, take their yachts that are moored down in the Caribbean. You'll get their attention very quickly.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I'm glad you opened that door, because you and I have been talking about these, various parts of the world where there's lots of tensions, whether it's China or elsewhere, where there are very wealthy individuals who we've done the stories that they are moving their assets out of these unsettled areas to protect them. And, crypto is certainly one of those tools that you can add to that tool chest.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it's...
and be secreter than that London flat that you can be seized.
Right, exactly. Or on the 57th Street there on Park Avenue, the huge building that is supposedly occupied by, international folks, and it's dark at night because nobody's there. So so there is some opportunities there, but we'll see how effective these sanctions are. I mean, it's a mixed bag, as we reported on earlier. Even some folks in the Biden administration recognized this early on, that they're going to have limited effect, but what's the alternative?
No, exactly. But you do, I do wonder, I agree with you that you think about whether it's President Putin, one of the questions we've been asking certainly around the newsroom, where's his money? He's been certainly moving a yacht and moving different things. And you do wonder about, that's a pressure point, certainly, that the world can impose on these leaders, I'd guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, it's an oligarchy in Russia, so you could probably target these things very easily, but you can see how the U.S. government plays that.
All right, we'll continue our coverage here. Paul Sweeney, Carol Massar, we are Bloomberg Business Week on Bloomberg Radio.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Dramatic recovery on a turbulent day for the U.S. stock market. Massive reversal, at least for NASDAQ. We've got the S&P pushing higher. The Dow does remain lower, but what a change from earlier in the session. Let's get right over to the first word breaking news desk. Lots going on. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. That's right. U.S. stocks with an aggressive rally off the open, led by beat-up technology names. Dow is currently down 172 points, was down 859. S&Ps, like you said, are higher by 27. NASDAQ is now higher by 294. The U.S. 10-year yield at 1.97%. Gold is down 20. Oil is well off the highs. And Bitcoin is now up by 3%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were telecom, tech, and consumer discretionary. Consumer staples and financials led to the downside. And leaders to the upside in the Dow, Salesforce, and Microsoft, while J.P. Morgan and Merck were under pressure. In deal news, the DOJ plans to sue to block the $13 billion United Health deal today. And in other news, Dow Jones also reported that SEC is probing trading by Elon Musk and his brother. Regarding the Ukraine, Biden is sanctioning Russian banks and will limit Russian ability to do business in dollars. And wrapping things up, Autodesk, Beyond Meat, Square, and Monster all report after the bell. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill, and to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg type Squawk SQUAWK on your terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Well, one of my favorite terminal functions I learned from one Mike McGlone is GLCO. It just gives you a global commodities overview. And as I look at it today, energy, lots and lots of green. Metals, I got mixed. I got some red there, but just big movements. European nat gas doubled. I mean, up 50%.
Want to buy some wheat?
Exactly. Buy some hard red wheat. So let's talk commodities. Mike McGlone, senior commodity strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, on the phone from Miami Beach, which is another story entirely.
Hashtag scam.
Hashtag scam, but he has worked it out. He's the smart one among us. Mike, what did the commodity markets tell you today? Let's start with energy, boy. We had Brent crude at $107 a barrel. Now we're below 100.
Hey, Paul and Carol, buy the rumor, sell the fact. What the markets are telling me today. So here's a fact of crude oil. Crude oil has had about 80% drawdown since the peak in 2008, and now it's got a great trigger for another one. I think crude oil, after this event, maybe it trickles around $100 for a while, but can actually drop to near 30. And that's not profound at all. It's just what it's done 3 times in the last 14 years. Because look what's happened in the world. The U.S. is now a massive net exporter, and we just got the best incentive on the planet now. It's actually patriotic to produce crude oil and liquid fuels and grains and commodities in the U.S. That's a fact. Russia, thank you for that. And I think what happened today is, yes, it's horrible what they did, but they just triggered the end of the old world and the new world, who's been going towards renewable energy and decarbonization, electrification, to completely accelerate that process.
Are you saying commodities are the new metaverse? Is that what you just said?
Well, the key thing about commodities, Carol, is the North America, U.S. and Canada combined, is the metaverse, is the epicenter of commodity production and exports. The largest exporter of LNG on the planet now, liquefied natural gas, is the U.S. If you combine the U.S. liquid fuel production with Canada, we are going to be at a 15% surplus this year to consumption. And that is before this price incentive. So now that we have this motivation, to me, this is just the trigger for the new world in free markets to push Russia aside and say, guess what, we're going to beat you at technology. And so where's Russia and Ukraine going to export their commodities to? China. Now, China's in decline. Their property problems are a problem. Remember, the key thing I'll leave you with this is China is having almost the exact same problems the U.S. had when the 2008 crisis hit. They're having a property real estate crisis, and they are the net largest importer of crude oil. Remember, 14 years ago, that was the U.S.
So the shale producers, I am shocked that they are been so disciplined. I mean, what does the commodity market think? Does it that our friends down in Texas and Oklahoma are just going to start opening the spigots and digging holes in the ground?
It's lagging, Paul. I mean, they don't have to dig the holes in where we're going. That's a key thing I published the other day. Rig counts is insignificant now. When you can hydraulic frack and drill horizontally, it doesn't matter the rig counts. In fact, rig counts are well below the peak from 2011. So rig counts peaked in 2011, yet the U.S. liquid fuel production has doubled to about 21 million barrels a day. And I see liquid fuels because of my farm background, all that ethanol. So this is just a major motivational factor for North America, which is very isolated and protected, to just crush it. Now, I think what might also trigger is a potential recession. We needed a little trigger. We got it. It's really bad for Europe, but from a commodity standpoint, I just look at the farm background of the people I know in the farmland. They're almost, right now, the price is almost double their cost of production. They're saying, thank you, sell a little forward. And that back 40, I wasn't going to plant. I'm going to plant it now.
So how do you trade this then, Mike?
Well, that's the key thing, Carol, how you trade it.